The best place to hide the truth is in the pages of a book.
Maybe we should just read. Maybe we should just read.
Welcome to Hayes Reviews. Yes, hello. This is Nick, creator of Hayes Reviews, and I'm back, and you're back, and we are here together, and we are going to be reading tonight chapter 17, I think, of Fabian, Freeway. I think it's chapter 17, but as soon as I said that, I started to doubt. Yes, no, I'm right, chapter 17. So, welcome. I'm very happy to have you here on the stream. If you're joining in live, fantastic. Please consider giving a thumbs up, even though you haven't watched the video yet, and sharing it and commenting and these kind of things. Say something in the chat. All good for the algorithm, which, as you can probably imagine, we don't get much help from with the kind of topics and that we cover and the sort of books that we like to read here on Hayes Reviews. We're not going to be aided along by the big tech companies out there. I'm surprised this channel has made it this far, but we must be doing all right. We're still flying under the radar, and so we've got a kind of Rebel Alliance type vibe going on here, where we're learning some important things from some important books about aspects of history that have been occulted from our mainstream textbooks, from the mainstream history documentaries and news channels and radio shows and schools, curriculums, degrees, university courses. There's many aspects of the modern world which pretend to give us the truth about things and where we are in the world, but are they really doing so? Well, I'm not so sure. So what I think we try and do is fill in the gaps, and the best way to fill in those gaps is to look at the books. And in particular, I've been getting onto a good thread of books recently, thanks to the unbeatable work of Alan Watt, the Scottish researcher, author, and truth teller who made a radio show at cuttingthroughthematrix.com for many, many, many years. And all that work, all his hard work is still available, and it is being maintained and retained and continued by his wonderful wife, Melissa, who is still uploading his talks, but also interviews that she herself is carrying out. And she puts fantastic intros and outros onto those works to add in more context and link them to the present day, because sadly, Alan Watt is no longer with us. Rest his soul and rest in peace, Alan Watt. But I'm hugely inspired by his work, and I've been put onto a number of wonderful books thanks to his foresight in mentioning those books and recording himself talking about them and preserving those recordings for people in the future, such as me, to stumble upon. And stumble upon them I did. I had no idea who Alan Watt was until about a year ago, in fact. And I was browsing Telegram. You know, I got pushed onto Telegram with all the rest of the dissenters during the lockdowns, when we were looking for a place that would not be censored, and where we would not be limited in what we were allowed to say and what questions we wanted to ask and what answers and ideas we were allowed to discuss and exchange. Telegram gave us all a safe haven. Now, it is a bit of an echo chamber because not many mainstream folk have found their way onto that platform, but it does remain and continue to be a good resource and a good place where you can upload videos and books and have chats and have basically uncontrolled exploration of ideas. And so I found myself on Telegram, and I was in a Telegram group, and then one of them posted a link to a talk by Alan Watt, and I'd always been a fan of Alan Watts, the British ex-Anglican priest turned Zen mystic entertainer who lived over in California, I think, on a boat with a bunch of hippies, and did his part in popularizing the use of psychedelic compounds for inner exploration, as well as the experimentation with Eastern philosophies and ideas such as Hinduism and Zen Buddhism, these kind of ideas which are very exciting and interesting and wonderful to explore. And I got a great deal of value and benefit from listening to Alan Watts with an S. His work is very entertaining, and it is eye-opening, and it is powerful in its own way, and it does have some good lessons, some good pieces of it's kind of thought experiments, if you want to put it that way, things to consider. You know, these kinds of questions like, can teeth bite themselves? There's just one of the random quotes I remember him talking about, kind of in the tradition of Zen Koan, Koan, which is, you've probably heard, what is the sound of one hand clapping? These questions which are designed to not have an answer and to sort of break the mind out of its usual thought habits and patterns, break the mind out of that by considering something which is implausible and impossible and silly and contradictory and paradoxical. And it shifts you into a deeper awareness of the present moment when you realize what silly knots you're trying to bend your mind into by considering these illogical ideas which are just bound up in the nature of language, right? So Alan Watts, very entertaining, worth listening to. Good man I found him really a good companion while traveling, and I was doing long bus rides and plane rides and minibus rides and tuk-tuk rides, and always have some earphones in and listening to Alan Watts discussing these kind of things. So very entertaining guy. But that man, as entertaining as he was not a patch on Alan Watt and the incredible work that he put out. So his work goes back, I think, to the mid-2000s, probably before that. But these talks tell us all about the kinds of characters that we discuss on this channel. So deep dives into H.G. Wells, into the Huxley family, into the Fabian Society. So that brings us back to where we are tonight. We're continuing with our exploration of this book, Fabian Freeway, High Road to Socialism in the USA by Rose Martin. And I mention Alan Watt because I've added quite a number of books to my collection since listening to his material. And it's always good to mention the people who inspire you and who you draw inspiration from and who you admire, right? To align yourself with the people who you look up to is a good thing to do, and to point people in the direction of those who came before, as helpful and useful as I hope Hayes Reviews is. You know, Alan did a lot of this work already, and it is there for free up on his website. So that's cuttingthroughthematrix.com. Definitely go and check those out. But this is not the Alan Watt Show. This is Hayes Reviews. So we're going to do something a little bit different tonight, and we're going to read from the book. We've made really good progress so far in this, and I think it has been eye-opening. It's been a bit of a page-turner, and we're getting to the good bits. There's only 4 chapters or something like that left, but they're all monsters. They're all like 30, 40 page long. I was looking back at part 1, and some of the chapters were 10, 15 pages, and now every chapter moving forward is about 30 pages long. So we're probably going to be doing a chapter per video, and they are going to be a little bit longer form than we may be used to. So who have we got in the chat tonight? I want to say good evening to Frank, LJ, Jeanette, hello. Gwen is here, and Heidi as well. Ashley's back, lovely, and CESP. Good to have you all here. Again, I'm so humbled and grateful that people tune in to what we're doing here, and recognizing the value to be had in reading books, and also recognizing that not everybody has the attention or the effort or the appetite or the aptitude to sit and quietly focus in on a book. So we're trying to break down some of those barriers and remove some of those excuses and kind of turn it into a group thing that we can enjoy together, and we can help each other learn our way forward. And that is what we have been doing. So good evening to you all, whether it's rainy or sunny where you are. I hope you're all having a good day, and I appreciate you tuning in on this Tuesday, the 21st of May, 2024. It is my mother's birthday today. She has turned 60 years young. So shout out to her, the wonderful mother of mine who literally made me who I am, and wonderful to have her with us. She's made it to 60, and I hope she has many long, happy, fulfilling, joyful decades ahead. So I should dedicate this stream tonight to my mom, even though she's not listening. I think she's down the pub, which is probably a smart move because the weather's good, it's warm, and the ale here is still relatively cheap compared to other places in the UK. So it is actually affordable to go to the pub. But with that said, let's crack on. So I almost couldn't get the stream going on Rumble tonight, but I did manage to press some buttons at the last minute and get it up. So if you're over on Rumble, good to have you here. Thank you for tuning in. We were also broadcasting on Odyssey, and that is a good place to go if you don't like the sort of censorship that you get on YouTube. Odyssey is a little more free speech oriented, and we are also broadcasting via Entropy. That is entropystream.live. And they're a free speech streaming platform, and that platform is also a good place to support content creators by using the super chat function. And as ever, if you want to support what we're doing here on Hayes Reviews, then under the video, there's a link, allmylinks.com/Hayes Reviews. You can have a look there for ways to support and get involved and participate. And there's a bunch of affiliate links under the video as well. I'm sure you're all aware of those by now, though. Oh yeah, okay. So let me, somebody's just asking about Rumble. It's a different link than the one that went out on Telegram. So I've put the new Rumble link in the chat if you want to watch there. Hopefully that helps. All right. So lots of happy birthday messages for my mum, and I will pass those on. She is wonderful. We got her a very nice back massager for her birthday, and it goes on the back of your chair, and then there's these little moving sort of pressure points that go up and down and give you a good back massage in the comfort of your living room chair. So how about that? Pretty good little gadget. And I was quite happy with that because mum has a bad back sometimes from all her hard work in life, and so a bit of relief for her while she's watching her Netflix and enjoying a glass of wine in the evening. So all good. And I have to say as well, one of the wonderful things that mum did for me, one of the many wonderful things that she did for me, was when I was young, I would say to her, the typical thing, Mum, I'm bored, I don't know what to do. And she would say, only boring people get bored, go and read a book. And always encouraged me to be a reader, and always encouraged me to go and read whenever I was complaining or moaning or not putting my imagination to use to find something to do. And so I always had books in the house, and she always encouraged me in my studies when I went to university to be an English literature student. She was very supportive of that. And so always there to help me pursue the things that I found interesting, that I was passionate about, and that I loved to do. And never there to put pressure on to say, oh, you need to be a dentist or an accountant or a lawyer or one of these high-paying, highfalutin type jobs. For her, it was more about encouraging me to follow my own passions and interests. And I think that is a very excellent way to do the parenting thing. Not that I know what I'm talking about because I'm not a parent. So take that advice, just sort of inexpert advice from the perspective of a child. Okay. So, we got Dr. Crispy Rothschild here as well. Good evening. Good to have you here as well. Okay, that's 20 minutes of rambling, so we should get into the book. So the last few chapters, we've been learning about the ISS. And it's not the International Space Station, it's the Intercollegiate Socialist Society. Now, the ISS had to do a bit of a about face and a 180 in terms of their branding and labeling when the famines broke out in the USSR. If you remember, the Soviet government was, after the Bolshevik Revolution, it was one of the first sort of, they seized the power and they decided to centrally organize all the materials and decide where it all goes, get rid of the Romanov dynasty who had been on the thrones, the what do you call it? The royalty, the royal family, get rid of them, and we'll just run things by Soviet, which means council. We'll have councils of scientific people who are rational and logical and don't get involved with any of that religious stuff or any of that spiritual stuff or any of that God stuff. No, get rid of all that, and we'll just have pure scientific, rational data analysis to decide and drive what happens and who gets what. What did that lead to? The deaths of millions of people, starvation, cannibalism on a mass scale. And it was at this point that the ISS in America, the Intercollegiate Socialist Society, were like, we're going to have to probably not be so obvious about our belief in and support of socialism. And so they rebranded themselves into can you remember? The LID, the League of Industrial Democracy. The lid on the top of the jar, which the fleas, when they're bouncing and jumping, will hit themselves against, and eventually they'll stop trying to jump, and you can take the lid off and they will never jump out of the jar. The LID, the League of Industrial Democracy. And there was also the SLID, which was the Students' League for Industrial Democracy. And the relevance of that title, Industrial Democracy, that phrase, goes all the way back to Sidney and Beatrice Webb, the founders of the Fabian Society, the founders of the London School of Economics. They wrote on very early on in their books, which amounted to Marxist propaganda, but it just had a different name on it. They talked about industrial democracy. And so from this point onwards, we've been learning about how this organization, the ISS, which became LID, then started to get people into the universities and spread this Marxist thinking, this socialist/communist sympathetic radical ideology to the young and the impressionable, to get people, to appeal to people's sense of justice and what is right and what is fair and what is good, appeal to that and say, don't you think we need to wrestle some of this wealth and power and influence and control away from these nasty, naughty, horrible capitalists who've built businesses and empires and built all this wealth for themselves? Don't you think we should take all that off them and redistribute it according to what is right and fair? And that sounds like a good deal on the face of it. It's like, yeah, we should redistribute things on a more equal and fair basis, shouldn't we? But of course, whenever that has been tried, whenever that has happened, it's a bloody mess. And it's a real catastrophe. And because that bloody mess and that real catastrophe was unfolding over there in Russia, they had to be a little more subtle about the way that they spread this propaganda and this sympathy, and the way they drummed up people's interest and awareness of the socialist program and the communist program. And that reminds me, speaking of Alan Watts, that I heard a video of his, I think it was last night. I was listening to it, and I'm sorry that I don't know which one it was. I just pick them at random and play them usually in the evening when I'm winding down and getting ready to go to sleep. And he was talking about how socialism and communism were systems designed to get the working class bought in to their own sort of enslavement and management, right? Because prior to that, you had the king and the royalty, the class of the like the aristocratic class, and then the royalty above them, and everybody was like, who do those wankers think they are? Like lording it over us, telling us what to do, controlling things, hoarding all the wealth, demanding that we pay for them. What a bunch of, self-righteous assholes. Okay, now socialism, communism comes along, and it says, and it appeals to that sense of injustice and that sense of inequality, and it says, yeah, we should do something about this, shouldn't we? And what we need to do is we need to take that control from that class over there and give it back to you, the worker, the commoner. Oh, so yeah, great idea, fantastic. But what isn't advertised and what isn't talked about is that in order to administer that power and wealth and administer the sharing out and the giving out of those materials, the food and the whatever the what's the word that I'm reaching for there? The utilities, all the resources. There has to be some class of self-proclaimed, self-styled, self-appointed experts to make all the decisions on behalf of what is right and fair and correct and just, And the question of who that class of people is going to be isn't really answered or addressed. It's just sort of assumed or maybe not even assumed. It's just kind of, well, don't worry about that. That'll sort itself out once we've had the revolution. But of course, what it actually is, what is sort of unspoken or what is contained within that whole movement and transfer of system is that the peasants, the workers, the working class, they're still going to be living underneath a system of top-down control. It's just that instead of having a king at the top of that pyramid structure, you now have this class of self-appointed scientists, and that is your top-down technocracy. And I thought it was an interesting point that Alan said in that talk, how this system, socialism, was just a way to get the working class to buy into and consent to that system of top-down control by expert, by scientific, rationalist decision-making, data gathering, control and distribution of resources, and that kind of economics as designed by John Maynard Keynes, who we've talked about in previous videos, and also leading to the welfare state here in the UK, which was designed and supported by, was it Lord Beveridge? I wrote his name on a card. Sir William Beveridge. He was responsible for the welfare system. And then we had John Maynard Keynes responsible for the economic system. And so it was basically the same system, still a pyramid, still a tiny elite class at the top controlling most things, and still the majority of kind of decent, hardworking, everyday people at the bottom getting shafted and ripped off. And Dr. Crispy Rothschild, you just nailed it. A centrally planned economy and society. So that's it, really. And so it's very significant to bear that in mind when we're thinking about and reflecting on how this was rolled out in America, because America was founded on the rejection of such a system. Originally, back in the day, it was kind of telling the King of England to sod off, and we're not going to pay your taxes, and we're not going to give you anything. We're going to fight you, and we're going to go over here and do our thing, and we're going to live off the land and create wealth for ourselves and hold on to that. And it was an experiment in how would you explain it, in sort of self-determination. It was a sort of experiment in self-determination where people would be highly responsible for their own well-being and their own welfare, instead of having this bloated bureaucracy centrally planning the distribution of things and deciding who gets what and who is deserving of what amount of things, taking it off people in the process under threat of violence and coercion, and then doling it back out to people who didn't contribute or pay into that system at all. So with America being founded, you could understand why it would take such a long-term, gradual planning, which is the Fabian way, in order to overturn that and to transform it and turn it into what you see today in America, which is very, very different to the kind of society that was envisioned when the country was founded, when the Constitution was written, and when the people were going over there, leaving England and other countries, and going out there to make a life for themselves and be masters of their own destiny, right? So that's basically been the last few chapters. And now we are into chapter 17. So let's continue. So this is a massive chapter. We might pause at places here and there to catch up on comments. I'm sure I'll be needing to wet my whistle at some points. But this is chapter 17. Fabian face cards in the New Deal. 1. It may be called by some other name. Those words run like a refrain through the literature of Fabian socialism, from the movement's modest beginnings to the present day. Again and again, they recur in the writings and speeches of Fabian publicists, from George Bernard Shaw to Harry W. Laidler to Upton Sinclair to Mark Starr to Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. Meeting the identical statement so many times over, one can hardly fail to realize that it is a clue to Fabian tactics, past and present. So clear a warning, so frequently repeated, is obviously designed to alert friends of the movement to the stealthy procedure of encroaching socialism, on the assumption that, like any other oft-announced plan of attack, it will be ignored or discounted by the prospective victims. In 1932, a seemingly impromptu but in fact carefully researched program for advancing social revolution by peaceful means was called the New Deal. Both the name and the program were first unveiled in a book by Stuart Chase entitled A New Deal. Never very widely circulated and soon conveniently buried, it was meant for a select coterie of prospective public servants and for the eyes of one man in particular, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. For all practical purposes, this volume soon replaced the moderate 1932 platform of the Democratic Party, which pledged thrift and a curb on federal spending. Appearing in a critical election year, its publication, like that of other books by Stuart Chase, was financed by the 20th Century Fund, an allegedly educational foundation set up for purposes of, quote, public service by Edward A. Filene of Boston. Director of the 20th Century Fund from 1928 to 1953 was Evans Clark, a former president of the Intercollegiate Socialist Society and vice president of the League for Industrial Democracy. In 1920, Clark had been employed as Director of Information for Ludwig Martens, the unofficial Soviet ambassador who was expelled for conspiratorial activities. Both Clark and his wife, Frida Kirchway, longtime editor of the leftist weekly The Nation, were intimates of the British Fabian socialist and avowed Marxist Harold Lasky, whose articles were featured from time to time in The Nation and whose ideas strongly influenced certain leaders of the incoming administration. Stuart Chase had graduated from Harvard in 1910 and joined the Fabian Society of London the same year. He was a certified public accountant and an equally certified socialist, with a flair for popularizing borrowed ideas in a smooth and painless style. In Boston, he was one of the circle revolving around Mrs. Glendower Evans, which included Florence Kelley, Louis D. Brandeis, and Upton Sinclair. During World War I, he worked from 1917 to 1919 as an official of Wilson's War Food Administration in Chicago. There he became vice president of the socialist-sponsored Public Ownership League, an organization dedicated to promoting public ownership of electric power and related industries. Moving to New York, he served as treasurer of the LID, was a frequent lecturer at the Rand School, an editor of the New Republic, and a featured contributor to The Nation. And I'll just pause there as well on this Rand School. So that's part of what we read in the last couple of chapters. There was the Rand School of Social Studies. And this is not to be confused with the Rand Corporation, which Bai in the Telegram group, the Hayes Reviews Telegram group, very kindly did a little write-up about the differences. So the Rand Corporation is a think tank which specializes in military strategies, particularly psychological warfare and other things as well. But the Rand School for Social Studies was a kind of doing a similar sort of work to the ISS, to the League of Industrial Democracy. It was educating people about socialist ideas, not producing socialists, but just teaching people about socialism, to help them better defend themselves against those ideas and better argue for them if they chose to argue for them, right? So that is just a little note on the Rand School there. It is, I think, as far as we could tell not connected to the Rand Corporation, although they do share the same name. All right, just a quick pause there as well. Somebody says Rumble doesn't seem to be going. Well, that is not what I can see it going here. Let me try. I'll try the link in the chat again. Try that link. If it's not going, then that is just streaming it back to me and pretending it is going when it's actually not. But I can see myself on there. All right. Let's carry on with the book. Admittedly, Chase sympathized with the idea of violent revolution as a cure for social ills, holding it to have been absolutely necessary and inevitable in Russia. Quote, "It may someday be inevitable in this country," he warned, and added coolly, "I am not seriously alarmed by the sufferings of the creditor class, the trouble which the church is bound to encounter, the restrictions on certain kinds of freedom which must result, nor even by the bloodshed of the transition period. A better economic order is worth a little bloodshed. But I am profoundly disturbed by the technological aspects of this method of solving the problem of distribution in a highly mechanized society such as ours. In the attempt, production might be shattered beyond repair." So here's the idea of ends justify the means. Well, if you've got to chop off a few heads to get the revolution going, to build this economic utopia, then so be it. You can't make an omelet without cracking a few eggs, can you? You can't have a revolution without chopping off a few heads. Except as a last resort, Chase did not advise catastrophic action in the United States. In the long run, said he, similar collectivist results could be achieved through national planning, regulation, and control by government agencies operating more or less within the framework of the Constitution. So there it is. That is the Fabian way. Right there, that whole sentence. In the long run, said he, similar collectivist results could be achieved through national planning, regulation, and control by government agencies operating, more or less, within the framework of the Constitution. To that end, he outlined a broad program based in part on Sidney Webb's Labour and the New Social Order, and in part on the monetary nostrums of John Maynard Keynes, guaranteed to lead in due time to a non-profit system. For the next few years, he proposed merely 3 major steps. 1. A managed currency to prevent accidental inflation and deflation. Well, they did a bang-up job of that, didn't they? 2. Drastic redistribution of the national income through income and inheritance taxes. 3. A huge program of public works to become a continuing program, especially in the fields of housing and rural electrification. Yeah, because they need to do something. They need to do some kind of public work to justify all the money that they're taking from people through the taxes. All 3 of these prescribed remedies were adopted in 1933 and after by the Roosevelt administration, whose program became officially known as the New Deal. Undeniably, socialism's first major, Fabian-planned opportunity in the United States came about through the Democratic Party's landslide victory in 1932. It followed in the wake of a financial panic of unprecedented severity, provoked by the stock market crash of October 1929. Few Americans alive today recall that the Great Depression, which somehow lasted longer in America than anywhere else, was a worldwide phenomenon of European origin, touched off by the failure of the Credit-Stalt Bank in Vienna. Through their contacts with foreign socialists, American Fabians were able to predict the impending day of doom in the United States with some certitude, and they were prepared to take advantage of it. Just going to change the lighting a little bit. Is that better? Some months before the crash, H. Stephen Rauschenbusch, secretary of the Socialist-fostered Committee on Coal and Giant Power, referred to a period of low wages, high prices, and general unemployment as if it were already a fact. He viewed the prospect optimistically, saying, "We can see more clearly the function which liberals and socialists, both those who are essentially scholars and students and those who are politicians can have in changing the social order. Rauschenbusch invited young socialists graduating from college to enter the government service, especially the Interior and Treasury departments, as a means of developing techniques and obtaining necessary information for gaining control over private industry. And he asserted confidently, quote, "Within the next 10 years, we are going to have a chance such as we have not had in the last 40. Within the next few years, private American investments previously valued at $93 billion shrank to a mere $14 billion. The unemployed in the United States were estimated to number 12 to 14 million. For the first time in its existence, the nation cried out for a political savior. He descended like a god from the machine, and he offered the people something that, with a flash of psychological insight, was cleverly termed relief." As a Susan Lawrence, MP, member of the Fabian executive and friend of Francis Perkins, Jane Addams, and Eleanor Roosevelt, reported at a Livingstone Hall lecture in London, quote, "By one of history's strangest freaks, the elaborate system of checks and balances devised in the American Constitution has resulted, for the moment at any rate, in the complete personal ascendancy of Franklin Roosevelt." On that occasion, the chairman was Helen Keynes, sister of the left-wing financial oracle John Maynard Keynes, who had contributed so liberally to the strange new fiscal policies of the Roosevelt administration. Helen Keynes stressed the supreme importance for the survival of democracy of what was happening in the United States. Susan Lawrence dwelt upon the practical opportunities it offered for socialism and socialist-led labor groups. So there he is, Keynes again, popping up, coming up with strange new fiscal policies, while his sister was the chairman of the, of what? The chairman of the Fabian executive, Livingstone Hall lecture in London. Yeah, I'm not sure what the chairman of what, but just interesting that he's got his sister involved, and they are offering relief through the form of the New Deal. I saw a moose. Hello, good evening. Says, I am a machine. I'm not a machine, actually. There is no AI used in the creation of any of this. It's all my doing. But I appreciate what you're saying. Well, these books are long, and we've got a lot of them to read. So I'll just say that. Hats off to your production. Thank you very much. I'm quite proud of where we're at the minute. I think we've got a nice little intro, a good little good bit of graphic going. Still room for improvement, but there always is. But one thing at a time. The dramatic emergence of Franklin Delano Roosevelt at that precise moment in history was neither as providential nor as fortuitous as it may have seemed to the general public. On the contrary, it had been painstakingly planned and prepared far in advance, almost 20 years before. As a crisp young Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt had been briefed on the career of Philip Drew Administrator, that fictional personage who devised a formula for centering power in the administrative branch of government as a means of imposing sweeping social changes. At least as early as 1920, Roosevelt was marked for future greatness by Philip Drew's creator, Colonel Edward Mandell House. It is noteworthy, and remember that Colonel Edward Mandell House said he really disliked the Constitution of America. And in fact, I think his mother was English and he grew up in England. It is noteworthy that in a lifetime of political observation, Colonel House backed only two candidates for the presidency. The first had been Woodrow Wilson. The second was Franklin Roosevelt, whose family name and humanitarian pretensions could be counted upon to rally such leftward progressives of the defunct Bull Moose Party as Senators La Follette, Norris, and Hiram Johnson, and Governor Gifford Pinchot of Pennsylvania. While his own record of Democratic Party regularity rendered him acceptable to old-line Democrats. The timely support Roosevelt had given Al Smith, whose name he placed in nomination at the 1928 Democratic Convention, gained him the governorship of New York and the uncritical goodwill of Irish and Italian voters throughout the country. At the same time, Roosevelt's experiments in social reform at Albany, where he appointed former social settlement workers to administer his new unemployment and emergency relief programs, recommended him to professional liberals everywhere. As governor, he activated the State Employment Service, along lines which American Fabians had been urging since the 1890s, and he made other innovations likely to find favor with the leaders of New York City's garment workers. True, his old classmates at Groton and Harvard, while conceding that Franklin was a gentleman, rated him something less than a mental giant. But even this might be viewed as an advantage in politics, where the too conspicuous exercise of brainpower did not necessarily ensure popularity. To compensate for any possible cerebral shortcomings, he was thoughtfully provided with a brain trust, a term of British Fabian origin, whose travelling expenses to Albany were reputedly paid by the 20th Century Fund. Among others, Felix Frankfurter, whom Roosevelt had known ever since the former served on Wilson's War Labour Policy Board, and such polite former Wilsonian socialists as Stuart Chase and Fred C. Howe met with the governor both before and after his nomination as president. Once in office, he could be expected to put into practice plans that Woodrow Wilson had merely been able to foreshadow. A no less vital factor in the progressive education of the president-select was his energetic and ambitious wife, Eleanor. While Franklin served his country during World War I from a desk in the Navy Department, Eleanor had joined the National Consumers League in New York. Inspired and directed by the Quaker Marxist Florence Kelley, the Consumer League was a prime medium through which American Fabians captured the leadership of social reform activities during the first 3 decades of the 20th century. Ostensibly, it crusaded against sweatshops, child labor, and excessive hours of work for women, and lobbied for standards of industrial safety. Many public-spirited citizens were naturally moved to support such worthy and emotionally appealing causes. In fact, Newton D. Baker, Secretary of War under Woodrow Wilson, once served as president of the Consumers League without suspecting its long-range socialist objectives. The Consumers League was only the first in a long list of socialist-inspired organizations with which Eleanor Roosevelt was to affiliate herself during a long and active life. Through it, she was introduced to that curious demi-world of social settlement workers, left-wing labor organizers, and assorted academic, literary, and political crusaders that Robert Hunter had described. Their channels of communication extended from Toynbee Hall in London to Hull House in Chicago to the Henry Street Settlement in New York and Hale House in Boston. Thus, Eleanor came to know Lillian Wald, Jane Addams, and Frances Perkins, who, like Florence Kelley, had spent some years at Hull House. Through these and other new friends, Eleanor Roosevelt met and fraternized with female leaders of the Fabian Society on post-World War I trips to England. She had been educated in England as a girl, and in the 1920s she had attended and lectured at Fabian summer schools there. The genteel, high-minded tone of British Fabian socialism impressed her, as well as the fact that it had achieved political power in the name and with the support of Labour. After 1921, Eleanor brought 2 New York organizers of the Women's Trade Union League, now the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, to see her husband and to tutor him in the theory and background of the trade union movement as they knew it. One was Rose Schneiderman, a red-haired firebrand who had organized the shirtwaist workers in bygone days and who in 1920 became, with Felix Frankfurter, a founder of the Civil Liberties Union and a member of its board of directors. The other was Maud Schwartz, an Anglo-Irish woman active in the Fabian-led British Labour movement for many years before coming to this country. Both were practicing socialists, adept at winning converts through heart appeal rather than dogma. They told their host about the English cooperatives developed with the help of socialist trade unions, which had their imitators in some sections of America thanks to the early efforts of Jane Warbass. They fired his sympathy with tales of ancient wrongs corrected as a result of union action and stirred his mind with the practical possibilities of an expanded and politicized trade union movement in America. The seeds they sowed in the course of various sickroom visits during the early 1920s later bore fruit in the National Recovery Act, the purpose of which was not only to raise wages and prices according to a Keynesian formula, but also to foster the growth of labor organizations bound to Roosevelt by ties of personal loyalty. Never a serious student, Franklin Roosevelt had been accustomed since boyhood to deriving his ideas from conversations with trusted intimates and members of his family circle, while retaining a superficial air of jaunty independence. It was not surprising, therefore, that his mother's old friend, Colonel House, should have been the very first Fabian planner to perceive that young Franklin was a rare jewel to be polished, placed in the proper setting, and flashed with dazzling effect upon the world at an appropriate moment. Above all, House recognized that Roosevelt possessed a certain adaptability, both personal and political, which the unbending Woodrow Wilson had lacked. The squire of Hyde Park, inclined as a young man to look down his nose through his pince-nez at ordinary folk, had succeeded in developing a genial, outgoing personality marked by good humor, which would enable him to adjust the most arrant socialist novelties to the realities of machine politics. "Mr. Sinclair, I cannot go any faster than the people will let me," he told the admiring Upton Sinclair in an interview soon after his election. Even an infantile paralysis attack in 1921 that left him a cripple failed to disqualify Franklin Roosevelt for the historic role he had been chosen, possibly unawares, to fill. A fine head, a triumphant smile, and a golden voice on the air, with radio just then becoming a potential political factor, could be deployed to distract popular attention from the fact that he had suffered physical impairment. As Francis Perkins, his devoted associate for many years, pointed out, one political advantage of his infirmity was that it obliged him to suffer bores cheerfully. He could no longer walk away from them, as he had been apt to do in his more impatient youth. In 1932, Colonel House lived just 2 blocks from the Roosevelt home on East 65th Street in New York City. Early that year, the small grey Master Marplot slipped in and out of the governor's townhouse almost daily to proffer advice and tactical suggestions. Despite his advanced age, he was then 74, House still had a national network of politically influential friends who knew what was happening in state politics and could sway the votes of state delegations. And despite his own depression-shrunk fortune, he was said to be one of 4 men who contributed $10,000 to Roosevelt's pre-convention campaign. The others were Jesse I. Strauss of Macy's, who had originally headed the government's emergency relief organization in Albany and who was afterwards named ambassador to France, a precedent-shattering appointment. William Woodin, who became Roosevelt's first Secretary of the Treasury, and Frank Walker, later Postmaster General, an anti-Smith Catholic from the Midwest who had just sold a chain of motion picture houses to Paramount and who, like another early Roosevelt backer, Joseph P. Kennedy, enjoyed the confidence of West Coast movie moguls. In those months, the radical-minded colonel proclaimed to still solvent Wall Street acquaintances that the capitalist system as they had known it was finished, and that Franklin Roosevelt was the man picked by experts to salvage the remains. For services rendered, House was modestly rewarded by being permitted to choose Roosevelt's first ambassador to Britain, Judge Robert Worth Bingham of Louisville, Kentucky, whose son Barry Bingham in 1947 became a founding member of the Americans for Democratic Action. The colonel's own days of White House authority were over, never to be revived. Somewhat wistfully, he saw his former guest room privileges and direct telephone wire conferred on younger favourites whose radical bias was as unsuspected by the electorate as his own had been. He had set the stage, however, for a new breed of informal presidential advisors, more potent, more elusive, and more definitely committed to policies of Fabian socialist origin than any mere kitchen cabinet of the past. The extra-constitutional method devised by House for relieving a chief executive from the burden of independent decision has become accepted practice today. Other leading pre-convention strategists were Roosevelt's former New York State campaign manager, Louis M. Howe, and U.S. Senator Cordell Hull. As a congressman, Hull had written the first federal income tax law of 1913, as well as the revised federal income and inheritance tax laws of 1916, omitting to place a permanent ceiling on either of them. It is unlikely that the homespun statesman from the Tennessee hills ever dreamed that the rather moderate bills he drafted might provide a basis, at some future date, for a, quote, redistribution of the national income, as proposed by Fabian Stuart Chase in 1932, and as included since 1918 in the Fabian-dictated program of the British Labour Party. The fact that an old-line Southern Democrat had been induced to sponsor the basic legislation so ardently desired by all spokesmen of gradual socialism was an early and notable example of success for the Fabian technique known as permeation. Personally conservative but politically regular, Hull was appointed Secretary of State by Roosevelt at a moment when brain trusters did not regard that department as of primary importance to their plans. Just then, the sole foreign policy issue that stirred them was the diplomatic recognition of Soviet Russia, a project in which American as well as British Fabian socialists took a lively interest. As in Britain, this move was described as offering vast foreign trade possibilities if sufficiently lenient long-term credits could be arranged for the nearly bankrupt Russians. The Soviets' well-publicized intent to purchase huge quantities of cotton in the southern United States, a promise that came to little, helped win Hull's consent to the establishment of diplomatic relations with that Ishmael among nations. It was the first outstanding misstep of the Roosevelt administration in the field of foreign policy. At a later date, as the New York Times well-informed Washington bureau chief Arthur Kroc reported, Hull's authority was repeatedly circumvented by assistants having a direct pipeline to the White House. Many of his policymaking functions were also preempted by specially appointed presidential envoys and by Roosevelt's preference for acting as his own Secretary of State in crucial negotiations. That type of personal diplomacy, originally commended to Woodrow Wilson by Colonel House and enthusiastically practiced by each succeeding Democratic president, tended to nullify the advisory roles of the Senate and the Cabinet as defined in the Constitution. Instead, something vaguely resembling the British Privy Council system came into being, the difference being that the Washington version was unsanctioned by custom or law or tradition, and that the identity of the White House counselors was often unknown to the general public and subject to change without notice. If bystanders wondered why Cordell Hull, an old-style American in the mold of Andrew Jackson, submitted so long to such indignities, they concluded charitably that he remained at his post some 12 years in order to avert a mass invasion of the State Department by hungry New Dealers and One-Worlders, as occurred, in fact, after his retirement. From the outset, however, Secretary Hull was obliged to tolerate the presence of a select number of Harvard-trained Frankfurter protégés in key State Department positions. On his arrival, Hull found Herbert Feiss already ensconced in the economic section. Feiss was assisted from 1933 to 1935 by Professor Alvin H. Anson, public speaker and occasional pamphleteer of the LID, the first of the older Harvard economists to embrace the doctrines of John Maynard Keynes. Alger Hiss, who had begun his career as the law clerk of Supreme Court Justice Holmes, rose to become director of the State Department's Political Affairs Section and secretary of the Post-War Policy Planning Committee. Secretary Hull evidently disliked having members of the Frankfurter coterie foisted upon him and managed to divest himself of some from time to time. But apart from an occasional delaying action engineered by his supporters on Capitol Hill, there was not a great deal he could do to stem the tide of encroaching socialism or to discourage its covert communist beneficiaries. And that is part 1 of chapter 17. I'm going to have a quick review of the chats and a sip. I'm really addicted to slightly salted ice water at the moment. I went on a long walk this afternoon and I've just been necking glass after glass of slightly salted ice water. It's so refreshing and moreish. I can't stop. Okay, so Rumble is not working at all. It says the video is restricted or private. Part 10 shows up as being 1 minute 59 seconds. So I have a feeling what will happen is once the stream's over, there'll be a video there. Because when I tried to stream straight to Rumble earlier, it didn't connect. So I had to start a new stream and I did it very quickly. And I think I made it private, which is why I can watch it and nobody else can. So that's handy. So apologies for you Rumblers out there, but the upload I think will show up. Dave Stevenson, good evening, says, I only realized today that the new model cities of the world started in the UK with Milton Keynes. Seems a strange choice of name. Milton Keynes, yeah. Yeah, nothing is an accident. There are no coincidences. So by the model cities, I'm guessing that you might be talking about the sort of 15-minute cities where everything you need is on your doorstep, so no need to have a car or travel to other cities or other places anymore. You can just walk and there it all is for you. Not the kind of scenario I'd like to live in. LJ says, movie moguls mingling with Fabians. That all makes sense now. Disney, Paramount, etc. corrupt evil mind control through movies. Yes, I completely agree. And I'm getting more and more dissatisfied and frustrated with television and series and film. It's just, I'm finding I'd rather be reading a book, one of my old books, or having a long walk if the weather's good, or playing my guitar, or playing a board game. Any of those activities are more appealing to me at this point than watching films and TV, any of the modern stuff. Maybe some old classic films, ones that were before the programming was so overt and so fine-tuned and honed to just lead people down a path towards like degeneracy and to desensitize them to violence and nudity and bad language and blasphemy and all these other things which don't seem that bad but really just chip away at the good and the beautiful and the wonderful aspects of humanity and reality. You know, when you're exposing yourself to all this violence, you know, it dehumanizes people. It turns them into objects, and it's a brutal way of it's a brutal thing to witness, but it kind of then it numbs you a little bit to brutality and to people being treated as though they were animals, and so I think it's not good for anyone to engage in watching that sort of stuff, and the less of it you can do, the better. So I'm trying to provide an alternative by running this channel. So how about that? Another sip. So a good chapter there. We learned a little bit more about Colonel Edward Mandell House. I've ordered a book about him, which hopefully we'll get here not too distant future. But it's one of the books recommended in Rose Martin's book, actually, and it's a sort of biography. So that would be a good one to get into. It's the one that she mentioned as a reference to her claim that Mandell House didn't like the Constitution. Okay, so we look forward to that book arriving, and it's an old one, I think, from the 60s or something like that, maybe even the 40s, so it should be a possibility for reading on the channel. But that last chapter, we see a little more of Edward House, and he is voting, well, he's backed two. This is the second of the presidential candidates that he's backed, first being Woodrow Wilson, second being Roosevelt. And recognizing in Roosevelt, not realizing that here's a young man who's not too bright, but impressionable, and somebody who likes to learn from others, who likes to soak up the ideas of his trusted friends and family, his intimates, and then kind of bundle them up and pass them off as his own, which means you can mold him. And I think the bit we just read about Mandel House setting the precedent for this kind of rule from the shadows, this unelected sort of deep state bureaucracy, which exists regardless of which blue team, red team is ostensibly running the show or voted in. There's this permanent bureaucracy that survive every administration and continue to advise and give guidance and do research and pull the strings and whisper into the ears like Worm Tongue, of Lord of the Rings. They continue on, and you can't vote for them. You can't vote them out. Nobody voted for Mandel House, and nobody voted him out. Nobody voted for his successor, right? That's the part of the democracy illusion that is never really talked about or mentioned. In England, we have these lifetime civil servants, and we have like the House of Lords, and we have a whole section of our political system which nobody votes for. They inherit it. They're just born into it. They're the privileged sort of parasite class. They just get that because of the blood running through their veins, and they just happen to be born into it. So that's what we got in the UK. And then over in America, you've got these characters like Zbigniew Brzezinski, your Henry Kissinger, you've got your, who was the schmuck that was running the whole Big C event? Fauci, highest paid public servant in the US, apparently. 50 career spanning 50 years, responsible for who knows how much death and destruction and murder and disease and pain and suffering, and still out there going free with was it HBO that made that documentary about him? I watched the trailer, but I nearly threw up watching that trailer. So but I think there's a good case to be made that the Fabian way is to establish this deep state, is to build this bloated, overcomplicated bureaucracy, and it's so convoluted that nobody can really understand it. But if you rise up within that bureaucracy, you're going to be set for life. You're going to have a cushy salary, nice benefits, bonuses, privileges, and you don't really have to do anything apart from show up to some meetings and chat a little bit. And I think the more you see of the scam, and the less you object to it, the higher you can get in that organization. And so it was a good insight that part of chapter 17 into this establishing of that shadow government, that deep state apparatus, and what comes off the back of that is not the hiring, but the selection of political figures who can be manipulated and swayed and molded and guided into a certain direction. So they stand up there as the public-facing figure who everybody thinks is in charge, and who gets all the nasty tabloid headlines written about them, and is divisive and all that stuff. And actually, they have no real power or say. They are just the actor who is paraded in front of the plebs to make the plebs think, oh, it's that person who's in charge, when really it's the advisors and the lifelong public servants who career think tank leaders and experts. So you can see that transition, that transformation into the rule by experts. And we have to do everything scientifically, because scientism is the actual religion of our age. Money and scientism, the two main religions that most people subscribe to and adhere to and observe and belong to. I'm just going to blow my nose. Excuse me for a moment. And a good little opportunity there to remind you that if you're interested in staying in touch, just in case this channel ever gets wiped out, you can send me an email with the subject title mailing list. And the email is autonomoususername@gmail.com. I will add you to the mailing list. You will be there in case I ever want to reach out, tell you where I am, if I'm doing anything. At the minute, I have nothing to advertise and nothing to sell, so I'm just collecting those email addresses to future-proof this project in case censorship happens. And as a thank you for joining the mailing list, I will send you a little download link where you can grab a bundle of my acoustic guitar music, which you were listening to on the waiting screen for the intro and outro for these live streams. So that's the offer. If you're interested in that, shoot me an email. I will get you the download link to that bundle. And then I think once we finish this book, I'm going to have a little time off from live streaming, and I'll think about other things that we can, other ways we can build out this and make it a little more valuable to people. But for now, the offer is a little bundle of lovingly crafted, yet inexpertly recorded guitar music. But I think it's good and it works well, and it's all me. It's all mine. It's all my original stuff. And so you can't get it anywhere else. So it is also unique. Okay, with that said, quick review of the chats. What have we got going on here? Hasdak says, I enjoy listening to people read. Thanks, Nick. You're very welcome. I'm glad you enjoy it. LJ says, I love old Sherlock Holmes, black and white, Basil Rathbone. Oh, the films, right? The stories are good. I did some university work on Sherlock Holmes and addiction, believe it or not, because Sherlock Holmes himself is an addict, although a very highly functioning one, but he is like a heroin addict in the books, and I think they hint at that in the films as well. But he is a heroin addict, and Conan Doyle wrote some Sherlock Holmes stories, and then he quit and he didn't want to write them anymore. He wanted to do other things that he felt were more worthy of his literary talents and aspirations. And yet the public clamored and squealed and cheered and jeered and demanded that he write more Sherlock Holmes for them. And so I was pointing out how Sherlock was an addict, and his audience, the readers of the stories, were also addicted to these Sherlock Holmes stories because of their structure, because of the conclusion at the end, the tell-all, the reveal, the prestige of pointing out and solving the mystery. It's a very Moorish experience. And so there were some parallels there between addiction of the character, what he was going through, and also the way the audiences reacted to the stories. So Sherlock Holmes, good stuff. Very, very good, fun stories to read as well. Dave Stevenson says, I uninstalled all my games recently. I agree. I've been lifting weights and reading where I would be gaming. That is fantastic. I'm really happy to hear that, Dave. And I wish you all the best. Stick with the lifting weights. That's incredibly good for the health. I keep drifting in and out of that particular habit, but it's something I need to get back into. Gaming for sure. I just shudder to think the amount of hours that I've spent gaming in my life. It is scary, but it's done. I've drawn a line under it and moved on from it as well. So I'm really happy to hear that you've done something similar, and I wish you all the best with it. If you need any tips on what books to read, I'll happily just reach out and I will send you a list. LJ, 4 years ago, I stopped watching TV. It made me physically sick. So do you mean you got physically sick because you stopped watching it and you were getting withdrawal? like a heroin withdrawal? Or you were physically sick watching it and you were like, right, screw this, I don't want this anymore? Because that's where I'm at. You know, I'm like, I don't want these images in my mind. They're gruesome, they're gory, they're just not the kind of thing you want bouncing around in your head. So I don't blame you there for ditching that particular pastime. Dave also hasn't had a TV in a good while. Excellent. CESP says medical sales rep. That's Fauci. Yeah, he was. Heidi has a similar feelings about television. Good. I think we're all in agreement then about television. Get rid of it if you've got one and buy some books instead. Opium addict, LJ saying opium addict. Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. And Heidi is saying muscle is our largest endocrine organ. So important. Right. Hasdak, I think as us all beat, says no TV for over 10 years. What? That is epic. I'm so impressed with that. Inspirational. Well, thank you for all that inspiration, everybody in the chat. Really good stuff. And I'm happy to hear people are lifting weights and abandoning computer games and doing things other than watching TV. Because I was literally thinking earlier about how damaging television is as a device. I feel the best way to think of it is a weapon. I think it's a weapon that's been used to dumb people down, to fragment people, to erode relationships, friendships, marriages, to make people tolerate being alone and disconnected from community because they've got a television that talks and it simulates being with people. I just think it's a weapon that's caused unimaginable levels of harm. And I think we won't, it'll be very hard to measure. It reminds me though, I've got a book over there. Shall I get it and show you a book? All right, impromptu book recommendation. Give me a moment. Big pile of books collapsing. This one, which is 4 Arguments for the Elimination of Television by Jerry Mander. And this is it's quite a thick book, about 360 pages. But this guy, Jerry Mander, he worked in television. He tells you in the introduction. I haven't read all of this yet. I've just dipped in and out. But he tells you in the intro, if this book has any basis in authority, it lies in the 15 years I worked as a public relations and advertising executive. Right. So here's a PR advertising exec writing a 360-page book about why we should eliminate television. And this book is from the 1978. This came out. 1978. It's like that sugar book. They've known about this for a long time, and yet for some of you might be hearing about this book for the first time. I only heard about it a year ago. And some of the arguments, the mediation of experience is argument 1. Argument 2 is the colonization of experience. Argument 3 is effects of television on the human being. And argument 4 is the inherent biases of television. Yeah, so that would be an excellent one to read, I think. But just to let you know and put that on your radar, if you have somebody who's particularly into television, you might want to buy them a copy of that book. A quick question here about how I organize my books. Dave says, I'm trying to piece together how you organize your books looking at them. That was an impressively quick find. I do have a rough system. They're all grouped together roughly by theme. Okay, so if you look over this shoulder here, these ones are all money and banking, central banking and money. These ones are all music and film and sort of media. And then that one down there, that third one down, that is all mind control and human experimentation. And just below that one, you can't see it, but where I got this book from is again, it's media. So it's books about exposés about the myth of the free press, and there's other stuff on there as well. Actually, that's a bit of a mixed bag. But yeah, I'm a bit nerdy. I can just remember where the books are and where I have them. I've spent quite a bit of time arranging them too. And then we got this one up here is basically all health related stuff. And above that as well, you can't see it, but there's another shelf above that that's also health. So that's like health and the history of health. And underneath that, you can see there tragedy and hope. On either side of that, on this side is all like MI5, MI6. And on the other side, okay, I can't do that. This side here is all kind of the lead up to World War One. Which I think goes nicely right before Tragedy and Hope. And the shelf below that, this is all CIA, FBI, World War II type stuff. And yeah, so they're just roughly grouped together according to theme. That's the best way I can describe it. They're not alphabetized. Not yet, anyway. But yeah, thanks for that question. Hope that was helpful. And another great point from Dave, it says, it's like how Facebook CEOs don't let their kids use it. Yeah, that tells you all you need to know, isn't it? about that technology. I heard Steve Jobs had a similar policy with his children as well. He wouldn't let them use any of the Apple products. Apple. That's right, isn't it? Okay, let's crack on. 2. Soon after his election to the presidency in 1932, Franklin Roosevelt met privately in Washington with a group that included Felix Frankfurter, Fred C. Howe, and some dozen members of Congress. With the notable exception of Congressman Fiorello Lagarda of New York City, the legislators came chiefly from the western states. Strangely enough, they did not belong to the Democratic Party, but styled themselves progressive Republicans. All had bolted to Roosevelt in 1932 and sought assurances that their aid would be suitably requited. Politically, they were a hybrid species. The elders among them, Senators George C. Norris of Nebraska and Hiram Johnson of California, dated from the Bull Moose era, as did Frankfurter and Howe. After helping to split the Republican Party in 1912, they threw their weight behind the Wilson administration. From 1924, they had enjoyed the somewhat eccentric backing of the Conference for Progressive Political Action, precursor of the modern-day Americans for Democratic Action. Quote, "Conservation of natural resources" was the high-sounding slogan by which these Solons maintained themselves in office and justified their emancipation from such routine concerns as party loyalty. So that little bit there about justified their emancipation from such routine concerns as party loyalty, that reminds me of John Maynard Keynes dodging conscription in World War I because he was a government employee, basically. He was allowed to be a conscientious objector, providing that he carried on, working for the government. So some people, they don't have to pick a side. They don't have to choose red team or blue team. They operate above it, beyond it, and outside it because they are the ones involved in serving the system which exists regardless of which team gets elected or selected. They joined or supported the Public Ownership League of America, nominally a nonpartisan organization whose perennial secretary and guiding spirit, Carl D. Thompson, was a former national campaign manager and information director of the Socialist Party. As early as March 1924, Senator Norris had introduced a bill providing for a nationwide government-operated system of electric power. Admittedly, it was conceived by the Public Ownership League and promoted at a so-called Superpower Conference held on January the 16th to the 17th at the Hotel Hamilton in Washington, D.C. Senator Norris registered at the opening session and addressed the conference, pledging all-out support. A committee was named to assist him in drafting a superpower bill. Heading that committee was Father John A. Ryan, later known as the Padre of the New Deal, and once identified by the Washington Star in a renowned typographical error as chairman of the Socialist Action Committee of the National Catholic Welfare Conference. The original Federal Power Bill, S-2790, was a bold one, clearly transcending mere government ownership and distribution of electric power. As Carl Thompson had stated from the first, the purpose of the Public Ownership League was not only to secure public ownership of utilities, but also federal control of railroads, coal, and, quote, all industrial forces depending upon electric power for their successful operation. As if by some process of thought transference, the introduction of America's first public power bill coincided with a move in England to electrify the railroads, and with proposals initiated by British Fabian socialists to install the grid system of public power. In Russia, Lenin's mammoth, and even now only partially completed, scheme for electrification of all Soviet industries and farms under state control had just been announced. At that date, as might have been expected, the public superpower bill failed on Capitol Hill. So did a subsequent bill of 1926 providing for a Tennessee Valley Authority and a joint resolution the following year, both filed by Senator Norris at the request of the Public Ownership League. By that time, however, the true mastermind of the public ownership movement in America, H. Stephen Rauschenbusch, second-generation Fabian socialist and one-time secretary of the LID, had developed a more cautious plan for what he termed encroaching control, designed to lead to ultimate abolition of the profit system. Champions of direct revolutionary action complained that his program for the gradual socialization of industry resembled the formula for achieving chastity a little bit at a time, prescribed by Leo Tolstoy in the Kreutzer Sonata. In the booming United States of 1927, both methods appeared equally unlikely to succeed. The central feature of the Rauschenbusch program, I think that's Rauschenbusch, isn't it, was a government-operated power authority, a term he seems to have coined. It was to serve as a yardstick for private industry and, by demonstrating superior virtue, lead to the eventual extinction of the private sector. From a book entitled The Public Control of Business by Keyser and May, Rauschenbusch unearthed a pertinent item, namely, that there appeared to be no constitutional obstacle to the government's operating a business or industry, provided such action was declared to be in the public interest. Indeed, as numerous court decisions seem to confirm, it was easier for the government to go into business than to regulate existing enterprises. That handy loophole, publicized by Stephen Rauschenbusch, provided the legal sanction for a whole series of business ventures soon to be undertaken by the New Deal administration, not only in the field of electric power production, but also in housing, rural electrification, farm mortgages, and agricultural products, storage, insurance, and general banking. With the onset of the Great Depression, the Public Ownership League's scheme for a so-called Tennessee Valley Authority was once more revived. This time, however, it was offered on the pretext of providing employment and stimulating recovery. Electric power was not so much as mentioned in Senator Norris's TVA bill of 1933. Other features were added piecemeal through a series of supplementary bills until at last the plan emerged full-blown. In March 1935, David Lilienthal, director of the TVA, finally felt it safe to announce, quote, "These dams are not being built for scenic effect. These millions of dollars are not being spent merely to increase business activities in this area. These dams are power dams. They are being built because they will provide electric power." It was not until 1937, however, that the actual scope of the TVA was disclosed to the American public. The assembled blueprint, showing a whole chain of dams linked together under the grid system to form a gigantic nationwide public power complex, closely resembled the original sketch drafted by the Public Ownership League between 1923 and 1925. Both the plan itself and the gradual means by which it was achieved illustrate the strategy of Fabian socialism more clearly than any other of the numerous schemes which devotees of that revolutionary faith have launched in this country. Begun on a small local scale, its slow encroachment mirrors the origins and progress of the Fabian socialist movement in the United States. It would seem, therefore, a coincidence that the first municipally owned power plant in America should have been established in 1896, at a time when British instigators of the American Fabian League were actively promoting municipal ownership of public utilities at home, and that America's first city-owned electric plant was located in Chicopee Falls, Massachusetts, hometown of Edward Bellamy. Over a quarter century of patient penetration and permeation was required before the public power movement was able to entrench itself in the national government, securing the potent aid of federal tax money. At the time, only a handful of non-socialist observers discerned the implications. One was the New York Times ever-vigilant Arthur Kroc. On December 21st, 1933, Kroc reported that the TVA, while not very expensive as things go under President Roosevelt, had spent over $40 million of a $50 million appropriation in less than a year of initial activity. And he commented shrewdly, It is even more than NRA or AAA, a social and economic laboratory. With the great mass of Americans numbered by the hurricane-like effect of the Depression and a socialist camarilla riding high in Washington, such discreet warning passed largely unnoticed. The TVA has now been in operation some 30 years, quietly but steadily expanding its empire, and accepted almost as a natural phenomenon by a new generation. The ultimate step, total control over all key industries, appears to have been necessarily postponed, but not forever. TVA was and still remains, as Norman Thomas revealed, the enterprise nearest and dearest to the hearts of American Fabian socialists, and the one most central to the accomplishment of their long-range plans for making and taking over America. 3. President-elect Franklin D. Roosevelt's meeting with Felix Frankfurter, Fred C. Howe, and Republican progressives in Congress preceded, by only a few months, the revival of the Tennessee Valley Authority Project, disguised as an anti-depression measure. It was one of the earliest bills to be rubber-stamped for passage under the New Deal, and there is no reason to suppose its intent was unknown to the president. Naturally, its champions wished to be assured in advance of the incoming executive's blessing, as well as to be certain they would have a voice in naming officials charged with the administration of TVA and allied programs. From that meeting of minds, there emerged a novel type of patronage, based more on ideology than constituencies, which for a time baffled political experts and continues to trouble many loyal Democrats today. Several seemingly mysterious cabinet appointments, announced soon afterwards by Roosevelt, were traceable to recommendations by Republican progressives. Felix Frankfurter, who had organized the progressives for Roosevelt, became a kind of one-man employment service for placing liberal lawyers and economists in the executive departments and agencies. The new order of precedence provoked Alfred E. Smith in 1936 to a pained and picturesque outburst. "Who is Ikes?" he cried. "Who is Wallace? Who is Hopkins? And in the name of all that is good and holy, who is Tugwell, and where did he blow from? If LaGuardia is a Democrat, then I am a Chinaman with a haircut." That's a great quote. A little field research along the sidewalks of New York might have given Al Smith a clue. For in 1934, 2 years after Roosevelt's election, several persons influential in the formation of the New Deal were listed as teaching at the Rand School of Social Science, which Al Smith once helped inadvertently to preserve. There were Stuart Chase, Rexford G. Tugwell, and Raymond V. Morley. In 1930 and 1931, institutes on unemployment, social insurance, and public power had been held at the Rand School to prepare the socialist faithful for the shape of things to come. The superpower movement, which claimed Governor Smith as a supporter, acted in close understanding with leading British Fabians, as indicated by a letter of November 13, 1930, printed in Fabian News, from the Public Ownership League's Carl D. Thompson to Alderman A. Emil Davies, later chairman of the London Fabian Society. It would have shaken quite a few unsuspecting Democrats to know how many major and minor office holders under the New Deal had been connected for years with organizations pledged to further the programs of Fabian socialism in America. Such attachments ranged from the Rand School and the League for Industrial Democracy to the American Civil Liberties Union, the National Consumers League, the Public Ownership League, the New School for Social Research, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the Government Planning Association, the Public Affairs Council, and other social democratic concoctions up to and including the Fabian Society of London. If the great majority of officials who formed the intellectual core of the New Deal were Democrats, in the sense that the average American understood the term, then Al Smith certainly was a Chinaman with a haircut. Of course, Smith must have known that Henry Agard Wallace, the New Deal's Secretary of Agriculture, who later became Vice President and in 1944 only missed by a phone call becoming a future president, had supported Smith's candidacy in 1928. Wallace was the son of Henry Cantwell Wallace, a leading Midwestern Republican who had been Secretary of Agriculture under Presidents Harding and Coolidge. He was the grandson of still another Henry Wallace, a member of President Theodore Roosevelt's Country Life Commission. Henry III, however, was a Republican progressive who had jumped early aboard the Democratic bandwagon. As editor of the family newspaper, the Iowa Farmer, young Henry, by his articles and speeches, helped to carry the traditionally Republican Corn Belt for Franklin Roosevelt. In that campaign, Wallace was aided by the socialist-led National Farmers Council, whose organizer, Ben Marsh, openly supported the aims of the Public Ownership League. For 18 months before the election, Wallace had also been calling for a reduction in the gold content of the dollar, combining the old dream of the Bryan bimetallists with John Maynard Keynes' seductive vision of a managed currency. Though a country boy, Wallace was not unsophisticated. While he cultivated a dreamy and mystical air and a friendship with the well-known Irish poet A.E., who brought news of the Fabian-led British cooperative movement to American farmers, Wallace also had a taste for scientific experiment. In his spare time, he had developed a special strain of hybrid corn which made possible higher crop yields. Through its American grain agent, Dr. Joseph Rosen, who had himself crossbred a new and hardy variety of rye seed, the Soviet government during the 1920s displayed an interest in Wallace and his hybrid corn experiments. The communications and transactions that ensued, in turn, aroused Wallace's friendly interest in what American liberals used to call the Soviet experiment, where a surplus of foodstuffs has never been a political problem. Given the tolerant attitude toward Russian communism that Wallace took with him to Washington, it's not surprising that the Department of Agriculture became in 1934 under Harold Ware the center of the first identified communist cell in the United States government. By 1936, many sober citizens were inclined to agree with Fabian socialist Stuart Chase that, quote, Henry Wallace had lifted American agriculture bodily out of the free market system. Wallace's chief lieutenant in agriculture was Rexford Guy Tugwell, another poetaster and rapt observer of the Soviet economy. In 1915, at the age of 24, he had published a Whitmanesque effusion that read, "We begin to see richness as poorness, we begin to dignify toil. I have dreamed my great dream of their passing, I have gathered my tools and my charts. My plans are fashioned and practical. I shall roll up my sleeves, make America over." A free verse paraphrase of the Victorian quatrain so popular among early British Fabians, those lines expressed the credo that was to guide Tugwell and his friends through life. "Why should Russians have all the fun of remaking a world?" wrote his Rand school colleague Stuart Chase in A New Deal. That's a book we've got to get hold of as well, isn't it? Stuart Chase, A New Deal. Stuart Chase, A New Deal. Keep an eye out for that. Tugwell blew into Washington from the economics department of Columbia University, having previously taught at the University of Pennsylvania and Washington State. One of the first socialist-minded economists allowed to translate his theories into government practice, he made the most of the opportunity. There was little in the application of the early New Deal in which Tugwell did not have a finger. Besides abetting Wallace in a forlorn attempt to transform abundance into scarcity by ploughing under crops and killing suckling pigs, Tugwell also sat at the Housing Board, the Surplus Relief Administration, the Public Works Board, the President's Commercial Policy Committee, and other newly created bodies. So this newly created bodies, this is socialism right here. We're gonna have to have a board for that, and we're gonna need an administration for that, and we're gonna need a policy committee for that, and it's just layers and layers of bureaucracy on top of bureaucracy, with nothing actually getting done. Just a lot of box ticking and form filling and backslapping and lots of meetings. He fathered the thought, seconded by the President's Commercial Policy Committee, of grading all industries according to their efficiency and utility and denying tariff protection to those judged a burden on the United States. It was Tugwell who proposed that consumers be represented, in addition to labour unions and employers, on the 27 industry boards to be set up under the National Recovery Act. The object of this seemingly benevolent move was to cut prices and profits, while increasing wages, a prelude to the disappearance of the profit system, which a number of early New Dealers believed to be close at hand. Like some other impatient neo-Fabians, Tugwell was chagrined at the New Deal's failure to abolish the profit system at once, and, like Wallace, he moved leftward with the years. His last fling in public office was as governor of Puerto Rico from 1945 to 1948, during a period when thousands of islanders were being airlifted via non-scheduled planes to New York City, there to find themselves enrolled on the public welfare and registered as voters for the communist-line congressman Vito Marcantonio. So, am I reading that right? That they flew thousands of islanders via non-scheduled planes, which I guess means planes that weren't announced or were non-scheduled. It just sounds like they were done in secret, and then they once they got there, they found themselves enrolled on the public welfare and registered as voters to help Vito Marcantonio get elected. That's what it sounds like to me. Anything like that happening in the present day? Yes. Hand in hand with Tugwell, two other early New Deal enthusiasts pushed through the scheme for giving consumers groups the decisive voice in fixing wages and prices under the National Recovery Act. They were Fred C. Howe and Mary Harriman Rumsey, still a Fabian socialist at 60, though calling himself a progressive. Fred Howe was a relic of the old muckraking era and a veteran member of the League for Industrial Democracy. Named to the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, he soon moved to the NRA Consumers Advisory Board, where Mary Rumsey flourished. One of the wealthiest women in America, Mary Rumsey was the sister and mentor of W. Averell Harriman, administrator of the NRA in 1934 to 35. W. Averell Harriman is also another name that rings a bell. I think I've heard Richard Grove talk about him. Anybody know who that chap is? Averell Harriman. Another one to look up. An intimate of Eleanor Roosevelt and Francis Perkins, Mary Rumsey shared their social outlook, having veered a good deal toward the left since her debutante days when she founded the Junior League. Francis Perkins described her fondly as a convinced and advanced liberal. The Rumsey estate in the Fox Hunt country near Middleburg, Virginia, became a happy hunting ground for spokesmen of cooperative agriculture and nonconformist economics. Mary Rumsey had struck up a close friendship with the Irish poet-economist A.E., the London Fabian Society's gift to American farmers, and she was feted in top-level Fabian Labour Party circles on her periodic trips to England. Long a supporter of the National Consumers League, Mary Rumsey saw to it that the so-called consumers' representatives appointed to NRA boards were drawn from lists approved by the NCL. A 2-to-1 vote against industry was normally the result. Outstanding among the lady politicos who stamped their features and foibles indelibly on the New Deal was Secretary of Labour Francis Perkins. A professional social worker, Francis Perkins had been trained at Hull House in Chicago, merely transferring the views and enlarging the contacts acquired there when she moved on to New York. Her first assignment in Albany was as a lobbyist for the National Consumers League and the Women's Trade Union Council. She specialized in reforms having an emotional appeal for intellectuals and a vote-getting appeal among labor organizations. As Industrial Commissioner of New York State under Franklin D. Roosevelt, she had imported a promising young LID economist, Paul H. Douglas, from Chicago to draft the governor's unemployment and relief program. Commissioner Perkins proved so useful in gaining the support of New York City's garment workers and other socialist-led labor bodies that FDR took her to Washington as the first female cabinet member in history, an appointment warmly urged by Eleanor Roosevelt, Felix Frankfurter, and the fast-fading Colonel House. Her personal influence with the president was exceeded only by that of her bosom friend, Eleanor Roosevelt, and her protege and fellow social worker, Harry Hopkins. Certainly, her quiet but adroit communication to the labor politics of the New Deal was highly prized. Secretary Perkins' 12-year tenure in the Department of Labor was marked by an influx of socialist-recommended economists, analysts, statisticians, investigators, and legal experts that to this day has never ceased. They were following the advice of Stephen Rauschenbusch to infiltrate government offices at every level. Some were so reticent and mouse-like that their entry into the federal service was tantamount to a disappearing act, and a full-dress congressional investigation would have been required to discover them. One of the more prominent examples, however, was Dr. Isidore Lubin, a lifelong collaborator of the LID, who served his apprenticeship as president of the Intercollegiate Socialist Society at Clark and Missouri. Provided with some protective coloration by a recent tour of duty at Brookings Institute, funded by the Rockefellers, Dr. Lubin was triumphantly ushered into the Department of Labor by Francis Perkins. There, with immense industry and true socialist zeal, Lubin reorganized the Bureau of Labor Statistics, whence official indices on employment and unemployment still issue, often at moments best calculated to create political effects. Dr. Lubin developed the oracular Consumer Price Index, which remains a constant but invisible factor to the inflationary spiral, although its underlying assumptions have seldom been questioned and never checked. He is one of the few Americans who could claim to have improved on the statistical methods of the British Fabians. That's another name, actually, to be aware of. Whoa, how long was I muted for? Well, seeing as I muted myself, I gotta sip. Okay, now I'm back. Not quite sure how I muted myself there. So I was just saying this name, Dr. Isidore Lubin, and his connection with the Consumer Price Index, which was still being used in 1966, probably still today, I don't know. Dr. Lubin's talents were not restricted to his job as Commissioner of Labor Statistics. In May 1940, when FDR revived the National Defense Council in the confident anticipation of America's entry into World War II, the president insisted on naming Sidney Hillman, LID official and president of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, as the labor member of that council. Roosevelt asked Secretary Perkins to help her old friend Hillman, so she loaned him Dr. Lubin's services. Thereafter, Dr. Lubin became a kind of resident statistician to the White House, incidentally conveying to the president his own and Hillman's views on preferential aid to Russia. From 1940, Isidore Lubin was, quote, consistently available and incalculably valuable in checking every decimal point on figures used in the president's speeches and presentations. Since Lubin's staff had access to the files and conferences of business people throughout the country, he was also able to keep the White House informed on the most private thoughts of management. A personal note from Lubin to Hopkins in 1941 read, I thought you might be interested in the following statements, which are the summary of the report of one of my men who attended the recent meeting of the American Management Association. Frances Perkins sparked the administration's move for nationwide unemployment insurance and old age pensions. At FDR's request, she headed a behind-the-scenes committee to draft the Social Security Act, whose title was a masterpiece of applied psychology. Like TVA, this was a project designed for permanence, though pushed through under the impact of the Depression. It was part of a long-range program particularly cherished by the secretary and her chums. Early in 1933, visitors to the White House reported that Eleanor Roosevelt was urging all and sundry to read a book called Prohibiting Poverty by Prestonia Man Martin, then an old lady in semi-retirement, but once the angel of the American Fabian League. Even before his inauguration, Franklin Roosevelt had agreed to take steps towards setting up a system of compulsory social insurance. It reflected proposals which the English Fabian socialist Sidney Webb had written en bloc into the 1918 platform of the British Labour Party, and which American socialists had been urging ever since. In Britain, that plan was eventually presented to the electorate as an overall scheme to abolish poverty by fostering dependence on state-operated agencies. Undertaken 10 years earlier in America, however, it could not conveniently be offered in package form. Thus, the pattern of the welfare state, which England's Fabian socialists frankly describe as, quote, the transition from capitalism to socialism, was not immediately revealed to Congress or the public. As in the case of TVA, it unfolded a little at a time, through a series of gradual but cumulative measures. By now, the Social Security Act has been expanded to include death benefits, widows' pensions, and some disability features. Its payments are based not upon need, but upon right, with the addition of public medical care for the aged, which in Russia at least helps to speed the demise of elderly pensioners, and eventual bonus payments for childbearing. The cradle-to-grave cycle of public benefactions will be complete. Although the New Deal's welfare program was largely derived from British Fabian sources, having been transmitted to this country by American Fabian socialists and such allies as Father John A. Ryan, Roosevelt chose to regard it as peculiarly his own idea. Not long before his death, he complained to intimates that England's much-touted beverage plan should by rights have been called the Roosevelt Plan. He pointed out that Sir William Beveridge had visited him in Washington in 1934. Like the Fabian leaders of the British Labour Party, FDR never scrupled to use welfare for electioneering purposes. Indeed, he once begged Secretary Perkins and her group to speed their initial work on the Social Security Act, saying he could not otherwise go before the voters in 1936. The legal difficulties involved in preparing the bill were considerable. There was no precedent for such action in America, and no apparent justification for it under the Constitution. Help came, however, from an unexpected quarter. At a dinner party in Washington, Secretary Perkins found herself seated beside Justice Harlan F. Stone, then classed with Brandeis and Cardozo as a liberal on the Supreme Court bench. She confided to the justice that she was trying to work out some plan for social insurance, but could discover no way of doing so that she would be approved by the court. Significantly, he whispered to her, "The taxing power of the federal government, my dear. The taxing power is sufficient for everything you want and need." So Secretary Perkins advised her committee that the taxing power could be used as a means of building up funds for future unemployment and old age payments. She told no one, except the president, the source of her superior legal wisdom. Yet somehow, the intelligence so liberally volunteered by Justice Stone ran like quicksilver through the administration, rapidly becoming a part of its operational philosophy. While the propriety of Stone's conduct may be questioned, his informal words proved more potent than any official opinion he ever penned. They furnished the key to that magic New Deal formula which enabled Roosevelt to remain in office for the rest of his natural life, and which was described in a phrase attributed to Harry Hopkins as tax and tax, spend and spend, elect and elect. That's an excellent summary of the system we live in. To head the new Social Security Administration, which Congress ruled must be bipartisan, Secretary Perkins proposed John Gilbert Winant, former governor of New Hampshire. He was one of the first important Republicans from the Eastern Seaboard to be invited into the New Deal Fabian socialist parlor, and he stayed there to the bitter end. A year or two later, after Secretary Perkins had prevailed on Secretary Hull and congressional leaders to support a bill permitting the United States to join the International Labour Organization, she succeeded in having Winant made director of that body. There, the craggy man from the Green Mountains was exposed to the tutelage of such adroit socialist diplomats of labour as W. Stephen Sanders and Philip Noel Baker, pillars of the London Fabian Society at Geneva. He displayed so much willingness to learn that the British Fabian socialist leader Harold Laski finally suggested to President Roosevelt that Winant be appointed wartime ambassador to the court of St. James. In this capacity, Jill Winant kindly consented to address a Fabian Society luncheon and entertain the executive of the British Labour Party at the embassy well before that party came to power. He allowed the charming but undeniably radical Lasky to write speeches for him, recommend reading matter and personal contacts, and generally set him straight. The International Labour Organization, or ILO, through which Winant was able to attain those social and diplomatic heights, had been set up under the League of Nations Charter, pursuant to a resolution introduced by British Fabian Labour Party delegates at Versailles. Since that time, British Fabian socialists have played a dominant part in its deliberations, both directly and indirectly via the Socialist International. Through the ILO machinery, officials of many countries who could not afford to be openly linked either with the Fabian Society or the Socialist International were able to maintain discreet contacts with both. The measure of Secretary Perkins' prestige in such circles can be inferred from the fact that she was able to get her protégé, Jill Winant, elected director. Surviving the League of Nations that spawned it, the ILO operates today from Geneva under the banner of the United Nations. Wow. Labour government and employer delegates from the Soviet Union and the satellite nations, as well as from the so-called free world, attend its congresses, where labour and government representatives jointly vote down the representatives of free enterprise and somewhat monotonous regularity. There, unheralded spokesmen of the Socialist International and the Cominform can meet and mingle unobtrusively, and there British Fabian socialists and their allies, Scandinavian, French, Belgian and others, are seen to be in command. Well, I've got to put a tab on this page. Where's my tabs? Here we are. Got a couple of new packets of tabs the other week. They're not very good though, as you can see. I'm not even sure which part of this is sticky. Which side's sticky? All right, we'll see. Yeah, this link to the United Nations, I think, is going to be good to mark and be able to come back to. Oh, I stuck it to that side. Oh, whatever. The ILO, International Labour Organization, set up under the League of Nations Charter, and then surviving the League of Nations and continuing to operate under the banner of the United Nations. Very important stuff. Okay. For that reason, United States business has refused for several years to send representatives to ILO gatherings. While the actual role of the ILO remains obscure at this point in world history, the suggestion has been made that its Geneva offices may well provide a discrete point of contact between the apparently hostile but mutually complementary socialist and communist internationals. That's the end of part 3. How are we doing in the chat? We've got more people who don't watch TV. Dave says, with the weather being nice, I'm crushing books this month. I've done Virgil, Ovid, Tesla, Hermes, and about to start William James Volume 2 of Psychology. That is some impressive stuff, Dave. Well played, sir. Virgil, Ovid, Tesla. Nice. Frank Lennon has been off TV for 7 years. Fantastic. Adam is catching up from the start. Good work, sir, and welcome when you get to this bit on the replay. Then we got Frank Lennon says, conservation of natural resources, page 266. The handy stick to beat all of us with all of the time. The New Deal then, the Green New Deal now. Yeah, well said. Dave says, I was thinking earlier how much quote unquote free electricity could be generated just by putting dynamos in gutters and the falling of water. They've no interest in anything like that though, sadly. Yeah, you're absolutely on the money there, Dave. They want to be in control of it all. They want to decide who gets it and who doesn't. They want to keep continuing to threaten people and take their money in the form of taxation. What was that phrase? Tax them, tax. What is that little phrase? Tax them, spend it, elect it. Right? I think sums it all up perfectly. I don't know whereabouts or how far back that was. I'm not sure I'll be able to find it now. But that's exactly it. No, they don't want people. It's all about dependency. It's all about making it people as dependent as you can possibly make them, so that they don't have the skills and ability to provide the things they need for themselves without having to go to the government. So it's a perpetual, extended, never-ending adolescence, basically. Just keep people as childish and dependent as you possibly can for as long as you possibly can. And that way you justify your existence as the scientific, technocratic bureaucracy that makes the decisions. All right. Rosemary Smith says, she goes walking by a river 5 minutes from home, grows her own vegetables and eats lovely meat, and no TV for 8 years. Wow, this is great. Fantastic work. Adam says, never got a TV license. So hey, how did you catch up so quick? You must have been watching on 1.5 or 2x speed there. Respect. Okay. Yes, LJ, we just got a mention of the UN. Interesting, that wasn't it? So I would like to know more about this ILO, not to be confused with the ELO, whether they're still going or not under the auspices of the banner of the United Nations. Oh, well played, Adam. 1.5 speed, yeah. You can't really go much faster than that. I don't think I make sense. I've tried listening to myself on a 1.75 and 2x speed, and it's a no-go. Okay, let's carry on with part 4. I think this might be the last part of the chapter, so let's wrap it. There were only 2 members of Roosevelt's cabinet who remained from the first to the last day of his extended reign: Francis Perkins and Harold L. Ikes. Secretary Perkins has told how the president-elect, before moving to Washington, called her to his home on 65th Street to apprise her of her new estate. Ushered into his study, she found him talking to a stocky, fair-haired man with the blunt features of a Pennsylvania Dutchman. "Francis, do you know Harold?" asked FDR. That was her introduction to Harold L. Ikes, variously known to historians as the strongman, the hatchet man, and the curmudgeon of the New Deal. If Francis and Harold did not know each other, they had friends in common in Felix Frankfurter, Jane Addams, and Paul Douglas. During the campaign, then just passed, Ikes had served on the National Committee of the Progressive League, whose chairman was Senator George C. Norris, chief spokesman on Capitol Hill for TVA. The League's secretary was Fred C. Howe, and its national committee included Felix Frankfurter, Henry Wallace, and Donald R. Richburg, a former law partner of Ikes and later named counsel for the NRA. Formed in September 1932, just 2 months before the national elections, the Progressive League could only have hoped to exert a decisive influence at the polls by attracting so-called independent voters and by splitting the Republican Party through an appeal to its liberal wing. With a Roosevelt landslide seemingly in the offing, the Progressive League had also prepared to snatch the fruits of victory from the triumphant Democrats. it contrived to secure for those progressive elements who had been faithful, in their fashion, to the aims of the London Fabian Society and its provincial offshoots in America, a controlling voice and hand in the new administration. Harold Ickes, technically a Democrat since 1928, boasted a long and unsuccessful career in progressive politics. A Chicago attorney, scrappy and embittered, he had won scant distinction in his profession. Instead, he made a living of sorts as a fundraiser and campaign manager for a whole series of defeated reform candidates, local and national. He ran the losing mayoralty campaigns of John M. Harlan in 1905 and Professor Charles E. Merriam in 1911. From 1912 to 1914, he was Bull Moose chairman for Cook County. During the next 2 years, he was chairman of the Bull Mooses organization in Illinois and a member of the Progressive Party's National Committee. In 1920 and 1921, he handled the bids of Senator Hiram Johnson for the Republican presidential nomination, then backed the elder La Follette in his third-party effort. In 1926, he managed the Illinois campaign of a defeated independent Republican candidate for the U.S. Senate. Since his student days at the University of Chicago, where he graduated in 1897 and took his law degree 10 years later, Ickes had been involved with a group of scholarly reformers and academic planners headed by Professor Charles E. Merriam, afterwards a potent figure in the council of the big tax-free foundations. So that's another name to keep an eye out for as well, Professor Charles E. Merriam, especially if he's involved in the big tax-free foundations. Charles E. Merriam, and he's a prof. Probably did it in the study with a candlestick. This group read the early publications recommended by the American Fabian League and the London Fabian Society on municipal government, public ownership of public services, and city and national planning. Its leaders conferred solemnly with Sidney and Beatrice Webb in 1898 when that oddly matched couple visited Jane Addams in Chicago. Thereafter, on the pretext of battling graft and corruption in government, always a handy issue in Chicago, a number of its members permeated civic and national organizations with a view to promoting Fabian socialist objectives, but avoided direct identification with the American Socialist Party. Thus, Ickes, from the turn of the century, had been active in the nationwide conservation movement. He helped organize the Illinois League of Municipalities, which after 1917 supported the program of the Public Ownership League. In the natural course of events, he came to know Alderman A. Emil Davis, a regular post-war visitor from London who was a charter member of the International Union of Cities, as well as an honorary vice president of the Public Ownership League of America. From 1931, Ickes also belonged to an elite corps calling itself the Government Planning Association, which drafted the tentative blueprint for the New Deal in consultation with a Fabian-sponsored group in London known as PEP. Recommended by Senator Hiram Johnson to be chief of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Ickes surprisingly walked away with what left-wingers of his time considered the prize post in the cabinet. As Secretary of the Interior, he had the major responsibility for coordinating and enforcing the Public Ownership League's superpower program. Ickes also persuaded Roosevelt to place the huge Public Works Administration under the Interior Department, arguing that he was an old hand at discouraging graft. Thus, Ickes had the rare pleasure during his first year as secretary of being authorized to spend $3.3 million on public works, then the largest sum ever handed over to any federal department in peacetime. And it was only the beginning. Written into the Public Works Act by the Department of the Interior's legal wizard, Benjamin V. Cohen, was a provision giving, quote, cities, counties, districts, and other political subdivisions a free gift of 30%, later 45%, towards the cost of building publicly operated electric plants. To speed distribution of this largesse, Ickes created a special three-man power board to review applications. In 1935, he appointed Carl Thompson, secretary of the Public Ownership League and erstwhile Socialist Party official, to the Power Review Board. Excuse me a sec, I'm going to clear my throat. And we're back. He named H. Stephen Rauschenbusch, philosopher of encroaching socialism, and chairman of the socialist-sponsored Coal and Giant Power Committee, to a spot in the Bituminous Coal Division, later making him coordinator of compliance. In 1941, Rauschenbusch was quietly transferred to the Economics and Statistical Branch of the Interior Department's Division of Power, retiring as chief of that strategic service in 1947. Yes, Dave Stevenson, good point. It is 3.3 million, 33. Rosemary Smith. Over the years, I looked up documents on WHO, the blood donation, 333 pages. They have stakeholders. It's interesting to read them. I don't have a print. I would have printed documents before they hid them. All right. So much stuff. And they always write it down. This is the thing that gives them away. It's just most people can't be bothered to read because they're all watching television, but not us. Where did I get up to? In 1941, Rauschenbusch was quietly transferred to the Economics and Statistical Branch of the Interior Department's Division of Power, retiring as chief of that strategic service in 1947. I did say that. First or last, a rather remarkable array of well-known and lesser-known advocates of gradualist socialism turned up on the Interior Department payroll. Ickes sent Ernest Gruning to Alaska and Robert Morse Lovett to the Virgin Islands, two of many LID notables with whom the secretary shared his tax-supported good fortune. He put John Collier, who later wrote a pamphlet for the Fabian International Bureau, in charge of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, with Felix Cohen of the LID as assistant solicitor. Ickes' own testy speeches and writings, which gained him a reputation for mordant wit and enabled him to wage a one-sided vendetta with the stricken business community of the 30s, were reputedly the work of Saul Padover, an angry young man who in after years became a founding member of the Americans for Democratic Action. Endowed with the power to allot large chunks of federal money for public construction in cities and states, Ickes dispatched a small army of scouts from Washington, sometimes referred to as Harold's Gestapo, to spy out the land. Obviously, they were in a position to exert substantial pressure on city, state, and county political organizations, which duly returned the New Deal to office in 4 successive national elections. It would be naive to suppose that Ickes, an old campaigner tasting the sweets of power at last, failed to take full advantage of his opportunities. Apart from personal loyalty to Roosevelt, Harold loved his job and was determined to make both the New Deal and himself permanent fixtures in Washington. He was the first member of the cabinet to greet FDR's suggestion of a third term with eager approval, challenging an unwritten law respected since the days of George Washington. Nearly $1 billion from Ickes' original public works appropriation and more at later dates was diverted by President Roosevelt to temporary works projects set up to provide direct federal relief for the nation's unemployed. As an emergency measure, this unconventional step might be justified by the real and widespread human need existing in 1933. There is evidence, however, that the temporary emergency was unnaturally prolonged by other administration policies which delayed industrial recovery. 3.5 years and $6 billion later, unemployment relief was still being administered on an emergency basis, with the most vocal pressure groups organized by communist unemployed councils getting a disproportionate share. While consumer industries revived somewhat, mining and manufacturing, which constituted the real strength of the country, declined. It was not until the outbreak of war in Europe, when the United States was called upon to fill military orders for the French and British, that America's basic industries were finally able to restore production lines on a nationwide scale. No problem, Frank. Take it easy. Enjoy the call. Catch you on the replay. The man whom Roosevelt placed in charge of distributing federal unemployment relief was one of the oddest bits of human flotsam to be washed up by the Great Depression on the shifting sands of American history. Harry Hopkins was a courtier from the Corn Belt. In later years, he had the look of an emaciated scarecrow in a battered grey fedora. His great talent lay in pleasing and impressing just the right people in his chosen sphere. Nominally devoted, during most of his career, to improving the condition of the poor, he escaped as often as possible to the diversions of racetracks, theatres, and nightclubs, and showed a marked preference for the company of the fashionable, the rich, the powerful, providing they were liberally inclined. No king's almoner of old ever had access to such resources as were placed at Harry Hopkins' command, nor more freewheeling liberty of action in dispensing them. Whether it was love of spending, personal ambition, a fanatical devotion to the chief, a socialist creed, or some strange combination of all these that impelled him, even his best friends agree that patriotism was not his ruling passion. Francis Perkins once described him as, quote, a shrewd man who had become acquainted with a lot of Democratic politicians while administering relief and the WPA. So well acquainted, indeed, had Hopkins become with them that, though not even an official delegate, he was placed in charge of Roosevelt headquarters at the rigged 1940 Democratic Convention, where FDR was nominated for the third time. The pragmatic principle which guided Harry Hopkins as Director of Federal Emergency Relief, afterwards called the Works Progress Administration, was expressed by his principal aide Aubrey Williams. Speaking at a relief conference in Washington, quote, "We must stick together. We must keep our friends in power." When seeking the approval of a Senate committee in January 1939 to his appointment as Secretary of Commerce, Hopkins admitted that statement had been made, but pleaded a man's right to one indiscretion. For American Fabian socialists, as for their comrades in Britain, power was the goal. Harry Hopkins, who ultimately acquired a degree of personal power second only to the president's, began his career as a social settlement worker at a salary of £5 per month, and dispersed over $5 million. Sorry, that was $5 a month, and dispersed over $5 million during his first 2 hours as a federal official. With a kind of inverse snobbery, he liked to refer to himself as the son of an Iowa harness maker, though the truth was, the elder Hopkins applied himself only a few years to that fast-failing trade. While Harry was growing up, the family subsisted mainly by selling candy, magazines, soft drinks and sundries to college boys from the nearby Grinnell campus. As a student of Grinnell College, Hopkins was deeply influenced by two of his teachers, Dr. Edward A. Steiner and Professor Jesse Macy. Dr. Steiner, Austrian-born and a convert from Judaism, had once visited Leo Tolstoy in Russia and written a book about it. At Grinnell, Steiner occupied the chair of applied Christianity endowed by Elizabeth Rand and held not many years before by Dr. George Herron, original chairman of the American Socialist Party. Professor Macy, who taught one of the first political science courses in America, had spent some time in England during the formative years of the London Fabian Society. He had imbibed its social and economic outlook and regaled his pupils at Grinnell with first-hand recollections of Sidney and Beatrice Webb. After Hopkins' graduation, Steiner found an opening for the young man on the staff of a small social settlement house in New York. Though not much attracted to social work as a calling, Harry took the virtually unpaid job because it afforded him a chance to get to the big city. Once there, he stayed and did what was expected of him, moving as rapidly as possible, however, into the administrative realm of organized charity. By 1924, he was executive director of the New York Tuberculosis and Health Association, which had built up a reserve of $90,000 and which Hopkins left with a deficit of $40,000. His political leanings can be inferred from the fact that he voted the Socialist Party ticket in 1917 and in 1924. Like many socialist intellectuals, went progressive with La Follette. During the summer of 1928, Hopkins took an expense-paid trip to London to study municipal health administration. This was a field long preempted by British Fabian socialists operating through the London City County Council, and his field trips inevitably brought Hopkins into touch with members of the Fabian Society. To his wife, he wrote that he found the British program superior to anything in America. Hopkins' meteoric rise, that began soon after his return from England, is suggestive of the manner in which the London Society rewards its approved and faithful permeators. From the autumn of 1928, Hopkins came more and more to the attention of Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt's intimates, especially Eleanor Roosevelt, interested as always in the social welfare approach to politics. In 1931, the merchant Prince Jesse I. Strauss invited Hopkins to Albany to assist in administering a program of state unemployment relief. A year later, Strauss withdrew, leaving Hopkins in full charge. At Albany, as later in Washington, Hopkins introduced a species of work relief first suggested in this country by Father John A. Ryan in his so-called Bishop's Report, and based on proposals made by a Quaker group in England after World War I. Actually, the idea of work relief for the unemployed had been developed in Britain at the turn of the century by Joseph I. Fels, the American soap magnate who joined the London Fabian Society. Fels' experiments were reported by the American Fabian socialist W. D. P. Bliss in his New Encyclopedia of Social Reform in 1908. To win approval of New York labor organizations for his work relief scheme, Hopkins was obliged to work closely with Francis Perkins, industrial commissioner for the state. In less than 2 years, he supervised expenditures of some $60 million from bond issues without scandal and with evident benefit to Roosevelt in the campaign of 1932. The new state relief agency received sympathetic press treatment from such Harvard alumni as Hayward Brown, then a popular columnist on the New York World and always a warm friend of Hopkins. Within a remarkably short time, Hopkins had endeared himself permanently to Eleanor Roosevelt, who adopted him into the family and sponsored him in every future endeavor. Soon after being elected to the presidency, FDR also received an exceptional commendation of Hopkins from Jane Addams, Dean of Social Welfare Workers in America. That is how a harness maker's son from Iowa, with a private taste for high living, managed to get to Washington in May 1933. There, he dispensed a total of $9 billion in direct federal relief over 5 years, until new laws were finally written and the Works Project Administration was abolished. Though such sums have come to seem almost routine today, at that date they were rated astronomical. Hopkins' activities as Federal Relief Administrator won the unqualified approval of so ardent a Fabian socialist as Stuart Chase, who observed, hopefully, that historians of the future might very well regard Harry Hopkins as one of the world's greatest administrators. While it lasted, the WPA was easily the most controversial agency in government. Not only because of its informal bookkeeping methods, but because it became a sounding board for much radical propaganda of the period. That was the decade of the so-called Popular Front Against Fascism, in which socialists and communists throughout the world collaborated openly. In 1934, the eminent British Fabian socialist and pacifist Sir Norman Angell visited Washington and toured the country as a member of Le Comité Mondial contre la Guerre et le Fascisme, the worldwide Popular Front organization headed by Henri Barbusse, renowned French novelist and identified communist. Youth, professional and cultural groups were its special targets, and its success was conspicuous in branches of the WPA that catered to such groups. Some critics were inclined to blame Hopkins' principal aide, Aubrey Williams, for the fact that left-wing agitators flourished on WPA time, notably in theatre, motion picture, art and writers' projects. There is evidence, however, that Williams was encouraged by persons more highly placed than himself. Far from being reproved, he was made director of the National Youth Administration. In July 1941, Williams joined Eleanor Roosevelt Justice Felix Frankfurter, and Librarian of Congress Archibald MacLeish in sponsoring the American Youth Congress at Campobello. This Congress was organised on the initiative of the British Fabian socialist Betty Shields Collins, Secretary of the London Fabian Society's Anglo-American Group and pre-war Secretary of the World Youth Congress Movement. Prominent at the Campobello rally was a perennially youthful Joseph P. Lash, a particular pet of Eleanor Roosevelt, who had been a leader of the Student League for Industrial Democracy and had also confessed to Young Communist League affiliations. A dangerous byproduct of the tolerance towards communists which top-level American Fabian socialists practiced as consistently as their British brethren was disclosed some years later. After long and painstaking inquiry, the Senate Subcommittee on Internal Security concluded that the National Research Project of the WPA had served as a kind of trapdoor through which underground communists gained access to the government in the middle 1930s. A number of individuals since identified as communist agents entered the federal service through that handy trapdoor, some rising to posts of major responsibility under the Roosevelt and Truman administrations. Transferring from department to department by a kind of mutual aid agreement with like-minded colleagues, they were not only able to supply information, but also to affect the policies of government itself. 11 persons linked with communist spy rings were discovered by the Senate Subcommittee on Internal Security to have entered the federal government via the WPA. An overall total of 80 persons in federal service, 37 of whom attained posts of high importance, were unmasked by the subcommittee as connected with communist spy rings. All were directly or indirectly linked with the group in the WPA. It has since been confirmed that appropriate authorities up to and including the White House itself were duly apprised of the facts by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, but continued to protect and promote the offenders. As a result, a small but well-placed network of covert communists in federal service enjoyed a field day which lasted for years, rifling the most secret files with impunity and sharing all that we have and are with Soviet Russia. Incredible as it seems, the lenience that made such things possible originated at the uppermost level of government. Franklin Roosevelt's personal attitude was revealed when he ignored repeated warnings from FBI and other sources concerning communists in the US government. In 1942, in wartime, he blocked removal from merchant ships of radio operators whose only offense was in being communist. The president's stand was officially conveyed by Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox at a meeting with naval officers on May the 19th, 1942, according to the minutes of that meeting. The secretary then spoke and said that he held no brief for the activities of the Communist Party, but that the president had stated that, considering the fact that the United States and Russia were allies at this time, and that the Communist Party and the United States efforts were now bent towards winning the war, the United States was bound not to disapprove the activities of the Communist Party, and specifically not to disapprove the employment of any radio operator for the sole reason that he was a member of the Communist Party or that he was active in Communist Party affairs. The secretary further stated that this was an order and must be obeyed without mental reservations. Soon afterwards, a naval intelligence unit in New York City, set up to control communist espionage and propaganda, was dissolved by the Bureau of the Budget, which had been transferred from the Treasury to the White House by an historic executive order of 1939. Instructions were issued requiring Army intelligence to destroy its files on communists, similar to the demand made by Woodrow Wilson after World War I. Only prompt action by members of Congress saved the Army records from destruction in World War II. If some members of Roosevelt's wartime cabinet held no brief for the presidential policy of being kind to communists, and if most government officials were either unaware of it or accepted it with mental reservations, the same could not be said for the president's more intimate circle. FDR's strict concept of personal loyalty required that any individual whom he fully trusted must see eye to eye with him on matters he considered basic, and once having adopted an idea, he regarded it as peculiarly his own, often forgetting the source from which it came. Roosevelt believed, for instance, that by giving Stalin everything he asked for during the war, no matter how excessive the request, the proletarian dictator would be bound by some principle of noblesse oblige to cooperate loyally in setting up a post-war world of peace and plenty. How did FDR know this? He had a hunch. And besides, Harry the Hopkins had told him so. This is not to say that Roosevelt was himself a communist, as has sometimes been loosely suggested. Having been trained and dominated for a good many years by Fabian's socialist advisors, perhaps he simply demonstrated the same protective attitude towards Soviet Russia and its agents as did those British Fabians whose road in the end has always led toward Moscow. Only convinced Fabian socialists and liberals at the very pinnacle of political power in Washington could do for the Soviet communists what they were unable to do for themselves, both at home and abroad. Hitler's invasion of Russia on June the 22nd, 1941, had aroused intense but mixed emotions among Anglo-American Fabians. If it restored fraternal bonds previously strained by the Stalin-Hitler Pact, the joy of feeling together again was shadowed by anxiety for the future of the Soviet Union. As usual, American liberals and progressives who shunned the socialist name while faithfully playing the game echoed the sentiments of their British tutors with a special urgency of their own. They could hardly wait to pour out the products of American industry and skill in defense of the threatened socialist fatherland. On July the 27th, FDR dispatched Hopkins as his confidential messenger to Stalin with an immediate offer of Lend-Lease aid, even though Soviet Russia was not yet an ally of the United States. At that time, public opinion in America was strongly opposed to this country's entering the war, and few persons outside the president's official family realized the extent of his private commitments, not only to Churchill, but also to Stalin. Less than a year before, Roosevelt had won election for the third time by virtue of his promise to the mothers and fathers of America. Quote, "I am not going to send your sons into any foreign war." That meant he could not ask the Congress to declare war against the Axis powers, quote, unless the United States were attacked. Sorry, that last bit wasn't a quote. That was just in italics here, unless the United States were attacked. In such case, as FDR pointed out to intimates, it would no longer be a foreign war. Hard upon Hitler's invasion of Russia, the New Deal administration proceeded to exert such diplomatic pressure on Japan as could hardly fail to provoke an open breach. It is interesting to find that Vice President Henry Wallace, by then an outspoken friend of Soviet Russia, took the initiative of writing to his chief, quote, "I do hope, Mr. President, you will go to the absolute limit in your firmness in dealing with Japan." By November 1941, if not before, it was apparent to such informed persons as Harry Hopkins that war in the Pacific would come at the convenience of the Japanese, the only question being where and when. Soviet Russia, it has since been learned from captured Japanese police records, thoughtfully arranged to help bring about the required incident. Through the intrigues of Dr. Richard Sorge, Red Army intelligence operative, Japanese militarists were persuaded during the summer and fall of 1941 to strike southward at American, French, Dutch and British possessions instead of northward at Soviet territory. Sorge, a German citizen, but a member of the Russian Communist Party, had managed to entrench himself as press attaché at the Nazi embassy in Tokyo. Because his 9-year-old spy ring also had contact with influential and high-ranking Japanese, he succeeded in engineering the desired coup. On October the 15th, just a day or two before his arrest in a general police roundup, Sorge was able to radio Moscow that his mission had been accomplished and that Japan would strike to the south. The blow fell at Pearl Harbor on December the 7th. More than 2,000 Americans lost their lives. The U.S. Pacific Fleet was crippled, and the United States became an ally of Soviet Russia. Thereafter, aid unlimited would flow from America to the workers' fatherland. In a letter of March 7, 1942 to United States war agencies, Roosevelt ordered that priority in munitions be given to the Russians above all other allies, and even above the armed services of the United States. Technically, the Lend-Lease Act of 1941 had stipulated that war material could only be sent abroad if the Army and Navy Chiefs of Staff certified it was not required for American military forces. This posed no problem, however, for the Commander-in-Chief or his personal Lend-Lease representative, Harry Hopkins. According to Hopkins' biographer, General George C. Marshall expressed the belief that he originally owed his appointment as Army Chief of Staff to Harry Hopkins. From beginning to end, it was Hopkins to whom Roosevelt entrusted the task of dispensing weapons, equipment, machinery, and war materials to our overseas allies on a scale never seen before in history. Comparatively, the amounts that had been expended on the WPA were mere small change. Under the impetus of the war emergency, $60 billion worth of assorted supplies were freely given away, with little, if any, ever refunded or expected to be. Quote, "Let's forget the silly, foolish old dollar sign," President Roosevelt gaily told the American people in one of his more famous fireside chats. Of the total, a recorded $11 billion went to Soviet Russia though the real value has never been accurately assessed. Such munificence not only ensured the salvation of the Bolshevik government, whose pact with Adolf Hitler had touched off World War II, it also made possible those secret post-war stockpiles which enabled the Red Army to annex its Baltic and Balkan neighbours, as well as Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany in the years immediately following World War II. By contrast, only a trickle of warplanes went to Chiang Kai-shek's China, ostensibly an ally, whom we should aid at a time when the capital, Chongqing, was being bombed daily on a 12-hour schedule. Of the material that did reach Chiang Kai-shek, some lacked spare parts and some was unfit for combat use. Hopkins never found time to get to Chongqing himself, though he made several trips under almost equally hazardous conditions to London and Moscow. For the most part, he left the mangled details of China aid to his assistant, Lachlan Curry, later named by Elizabeth Bentley, testifying before the Senate Subcommittee on Internal Security as a full-fledged member of the Silver Master Group, and that Silver Master Group is a communist group, and a prime collaborator of wartime Soviet espionage groups in Washington. As the undisputed Tsar of Lend-Lease, operating sometimes with and sometimes without portfolio, Hopkins was in his element. Temperamentally, there was nothing he enjoyed more than spending money, and no one ever had more to spend. Caring little for titles or personal wealth, he was entranced by the perquisites and the sense of power, a point of view that he seems to have shared with many socialist and communist leaders. Warned by the experience of an earlier White House confidant, Colonel House, Hopkins was careful not to overplay his hand. Prudently, he described himself as no more than an office boy, and he displayed such intense devotion to the president that newsmen remarked that Hopkins would have jumped off the Washington Monument if FDR had happened to suggest it. Yet, in the area of wartime production and distribution, Harry Hopkins was in effect the Deputy President of the United States, a function quite unforeseen by the framers of the Constitution. In matters of the gravest consequence, he was both intermediary and advisor to the President, making his headquarters at the Executive Mansion and actually residing for several years in the Lincoln bedroom. Chronically ill with a nutritional ailment following an operation for a stomach cancer, Hopkins summoned from some mysterious reserve the energy to serve as expediter and hidden persuader for the duration of the war. Besides the ever-present Dr. Isidore Lubin, Hopkins' own preferred aides included Leon Henderson of the Office of Price Administration and Sidney Hillman and Robert Nathan of the Office of Production Management. Of these, Lubin and Hillman were longtime officers of the Fabian Socialist LID, while Henderson became a founding member of the post-war Americans for Democratic Action. At the American Embassy in London, where John Winant reigned and Benjamin V. Cohen acted as wartime counsel, Hopkins could fraternize unseen with top British Fabian socialists, among them Herbert Morrison, Home Secretary and Minister of Home Security in Churchill's coalition cabinet. As early as 1940, Hopkins had written to Roosevelt, "We must marshal our complete economic strength for the task of defense," adding in approved Fabian socialist vein. "This means that instead of retreating from our social and economic objectives, we should push forward vigorously to abolish poverty from the land." It was through Hopkins that the apparently non-political Dr. Vannevar Bush, then Dean of Engineering at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, felt constrained to submit his now famous memorandum to the President on new weapons research, notably in the field of atomic fission. Together with Hopkins, Dr. Bush prepared a letter of authorization for FDR's signature, setting up the organization that led to development of the atom bomb. In conversations at Casablanca during January 1943, Winston Churchill discussed atomic matters with Roosevelt in Hopkins' presence. A month later, Churchill initiated a lengthy cable correspondence on the subject with Hopkins. The Prime Minister protested because the United States had suddenly ceased pooling information on atomic research with its British ally. The reason was that in December 1942, at a secret laboratory located under the stands at the University of Chicago's Stack Field, a team of American scientists had finally succeeded in splitting the atom. At this point, the project moved from the research stage into the field of weapon design and construction under control of the War Department. Dr. Bush spelled out the revised information policy in a memorandum of March 31 to Hopkins, which concluded, quote, "To step beyond it would mean to furnish information on secret military matters to individuals who wish it either because of general interest or because of its application to non-war or post-war matters. To do so would decrease security without advancing the war effort." Clearly, Hopkins was one of a very few persons who were conversant from the start with the atom bomb project in America. He was also precisely informed on the policy called for by military security. If he chose to ignore or override such precautions, it could only be attributed either to an incurable lightness of mind or a well-developed tendency to favor other interests above those of the United States. Not until late in 1949 was it definitely proved, on the strength of reliable records and equally reliable United States Army witnesses, that wartime federal agencies had shipped to Soviet Russia rare chemicals and minerals suitable for use in atomic research, along with miles of alloyed tubing and pipe that could be used in construction of an atomic pile. At least 3/4 of a ton of uranium chemicals were found to have been delivered through Lend-Lease channels to Russia in March and June 1943 and in June 1944. It was further confirmed that 2.2 pounds of pure uranium was sent from this country to the Soviet Union at a moment when the entire American stock amounted to 4.5 pounds. Wow. Such forbidden items could not possibly have moved through the Lend-Lease pipeline without official United States certificates of release issued by order of Harry Hopkins. Responsible testimony was given to a committee of Congress indicating that Hopkins was not merely aware of these transactions, but took a keen interest in pushing them through. In March 1943, when information on atomic matters was apparently being withheld from Churchill, an official but apparently purloined map of the Oak Ridge atomic plant and a report on details of its construction went forward to Russia by plane via Great Falls, Montana. Clipped to the documents was a covering letter on White House stationery, signed simply HH, and addressed to A.I. Mikoyan, then Soviet Deputy of Foreign Trade in charge of Lend-Lease at the receiving end. Here was the supreme example of what Soviet Purchasing Commission employees in New York referred to, ironically, as Super Lend-Lease. The Fabian face cards in the New Deal have been exposed. For the first time in history, a program of gradualist socialism, backed by political power and perpetuated by every trick of applied psychology, was put into effect. Instigated by the foremost brains of the London Society, It was implemented by Fabian socialist intellectuals and welfare workers in the United States who used many well-meaning or accommodating citizens as unconscious tools. Above all, its leaders had access to the apparently limitless industrial and financial resources of the greatest capitalist nation on earth. Thus, the Fabian socialist movements in America and England moved into a new phase in which nomenclature did not matter and where dealings between governments were manipulated on instructions from international socialists in London. Without the combined efforts of highly placed Fabian socialists both in England and America, the apparently uneasy but nonetheless recurrent coalition of the Second and Third Internationals could never have come about. And that is the end. Chapter 17. Chapter 18. Coming up is secret weaponry. But we're not doing that tonight, I'm afraid. That was such a long chapter. My voice is sore. But I hope you enjoyed it. That's a really hard one to try and summarize in any sort of meaningful way. So much going on, so many names. Harry Hopkins, he's another one to look out for. I'm going to write him down on my little card here. So, Prof. Charles E. Merriam, Harry Hopkins. So he was FDR's vice pres, right? I think. I'm going to look that up quickly. He seems like a key player. Definitely. Let's see what we got for Harry Hopkins. American New Deal administrator and World War II diplomat. Yeah, there he is. I'm saying there he is. I know you can't see what I'm looking at, can you? Not now. Ba-ba-ba. There he is. There's Harry Hopkins, the man we've just been learning about. So he was only in office for 2 years, but sounds like he did quite a bit of damage in those 2 years. We won't go through all this now, but have a look at the picture. I don't know. Looks a bit... I don't know. What do you make of that picture? Would you trust him? Would you trust him to spend all your hard-earned money? Quite a lot of stuff going on here. There's some stuff here about the relations with the Soviet Union, though. So, a bit about his personal life. He married a Hungarian Jewish immigrant. Was he Jewish? Where will it say? Early life. It doesn't say, does it? Harness shop. Bowling. His dad liked bowling. Oh, looks like his mother was deep into the Methodist church. Anyway. Harry Hopkins, that's a name that I hadn't heard before that I will take away and start to learn a bit about. Well, yeah, that was a massive chapter, so much in there. The link, the ILO, the ILO link to the United Nations is another key takeaway from that bit as well, I think. So let's have a look if that is still going. ILO. International Labour Organization, ILO.org. Here it is. That's it, isn't it? Check their partnerships. Well, they got the buzzwords. They got all the right buzzwords. Social justice. They've got 50 years of experience. Where does it say something about history? Data standards, partnerships, more. Nothing here about history. We try about. No, it doesn't tell us about. Doesn't tell us anything about history. Oh, here we go. The only tripartite UN agency since 1919. The ILO brings together governments, employers, and workers of 187 member states to set labor standards, develop policies and devise programs promoting decent work for all men and women. Sounds good, right? Gilbert F. Huangbo. He's the 11th Director General. Okay, we're just going down different rabbit holes now, and that's not what we're here for. We're here to read. But it sounds like the stories, the plots, the history laid out in this book is still very relevant and still unfolding in the modern day, which makes me very excited to read the Milner-Fabian conspiracy, which is where the introduction to this book is where I found out about the Fabian Freeway book. But I don't know if this gentleman is still alive, so I'm not sure we'll be able to read this one. But I would really like to read this one with you because I'm looking for, I want to read that. But I've got to read Tragedy and Hope first. It kind of goes like Fabian Freeway plus Tragedy and Hope. And then this book follows on from the two of them. So we got a lot to get through. But yeah, I'm definitely going to have to go back and re-listen to that chapter because there was so much in there that, it's going to take a few listens for that all to sink in, I think. So we'll just have a quick view of the chats and then we'll wrap it up. Dave Stevenson says, they conspired on space, nukes, diseases, and other control fear stories. And that's my take anyway. Yeah, I would agree with you there. Gwen says, I haven't watched TV for about 8 years. Well done. This is great. How many TV haters we have in the group. It's fantastic. Dave says, I need a big spider's web poster on the wall of the post-war elites. Yeah, I mean the Bertrand Russell book ties in on your topic of conspiring on the nukes. The Bertrand Russell ties in because that's like the fear porn, pushing how scary these things are, and everyone needs to be nervous and afraid and terrified, and we need a global government to control them to make sure we don't all kill ourselves with nukes. Then you've got the Rockefeller Foundation book that we read about how the scientists working on the nukes were funded by the Rockefellers. So it does, but then also the Rockefellers were funding allopathic medicine, and they were training doctors all over the place and inviting them into America and training them up and sending them back to their home countries, laying the foundation, pun intended, for the allopathic germ theory model of disease and illness. And that had to be there in order for the Big C event to have been so successful in 2020. So I think all these things like space, I won't even go into right now, but there's some really dodgy stuff going over at NASA. The amount of money that those guys hoover up and the amount that they spend on CGI. But yeah, diseases, nukes, fear, and control. That's what it's all about. And it's to scare the average Joe and Jane. And it's like, well, you need us to look after you, don't you? You need the scientific bureaucracy of a top-down controlled, technocratic, centralized system to protect you because you're so weak and scared and afraid and vulnerable and you can't protect yourself. Therefore, you need us to do it. So give us all your money and stay in your house and watch television and be fearful. That's basically what they want us to do, isn't it? LJ says, not with those eye. I'm not quite sure what that is a comment on. So we'll just leave that there. But Adam says, thanks for doing these streams, Nick. You are very welcome, sir. Good vid and good night, says Hasdak, good night. And CSP says, when I see 1919, I'm reminded of the beginning of the end. And I have no idea why. Do you mean the number or the year? I mean, the year could be in reference. The year could be a reference to this. Paris 1919. This is Margaret Macmillan's book about the peace conference. Haven't read it. I just grabbed it on Richard Grove's recommendation. But Woodrow Wilson's in here with his 14 points. And the 14 points were alleged to have been written or largely influenced by Sidney Webb, I think. Interestingly, on just reading on the on the blurb on the inside flap here. I've got a book cam. What am I doing? Why am I not showing you this? Sorry. Just reading on the blurb on the inside here. So we got Woodrow Wilson is 14 points. We got John Maynard Keynes makes an appearance. Lawrence of Arabia, he's in there. Ho Chi Minh, he's going to be in. Because apparently Ho Chi Minh wanted Vietnam to be on the same sort of par as America was founded, with its own constitution and a large, based on sort of freedom and self-determination. So this one looks pretty good. This book is so messed up and old though. Look at all the pages are all off center and whatnot. But another good one we could do at some point. But is that what you mean? Maybe that's why 1919 gives you the willies. Okay, let's wrap it up. Get some rest. We're back on Thursday, 7 p.m. We'll do another chapter. I'll just commit to one chapter per reading now. We'll just quickly check how many we got left. So we just did that. So we've only got 1, 2, 3. There's only four chapters left. And the next one is, goodness me, the next one's 45 pages long. So the next one's going to be another epic chapter about secret weapons. So make sure you're prepared for that. Thursday night, another epic session. We'll do another long. What did this come in on? Just under 3 hours. That's good. Alrighty, let's wrap it up. Thank you all for being here. You know what to do if you feel like supporting in any way, but just being here and showing up and benefiting and, putting energy into what we do, which is learning from books and trying to spread that enthusiasm, trying to coax more people away from the television screen, the tell-lie vision screen, or the tell-a-vision screen. Let's get them off the screens and let's try and get them into the books. And let's tell them, look at all the detail, all the names and the places and the characters and the people that you never even heard of contained in this book. Way more than you would ever get on your BBC documentary, right? So much more to learn, so much more beneficial to our minds, our vocabulary, our attention span, our ability to concentrate, our ability to put events together and to basically act like detectives. We're combing through all this information in this book and we're trying to pick out names and make connections and distill it down to the important events so that we can package that up and explain it to other people. It's just so exciting and uplifting and fun and invigorating, I think. So let's continue to participate together and go on this journey, and other people will, see what's going on over here and they'll start to get curious and maybe they'll want to get involved some further down the line as well. But we shall see. But for now, let's wrap it up, and I'll see you on Thursday, I hope. So good night to you all, Gwen, LJ, Rosemary, Dave, CESP. You are all extremely welcome. And I thank you for being here, and that's even better than the bit that I do is you guys showing up and participating, So let's keep it going. So take care of yourselves. Enjoy the rest of enjoy what have you got, Wednesday. I've got quite an exciting little trip coming up tomorrow night, but maybe I'll tell you a little bit more about that on Thursday. We'll see what happens. And then I'll be back 7 o'clock Thursday and we'll do another chapter. Okay. So take it easy, enjoy yourselves, take care of yourselves and each other, and see you on Thursday. And for tonight, I will say one final thing, as usual, God bless.